Chapter 1. The Escape. Harry could have stayed perfectly still until morning. It would have been easier, certainly safer. But the gnawing emptiness in his belly had grown beyond simple hunger into something that clawed at his ribs like a living thing, and the memory of Uncle Vernon's purple face, promising 3 days of thinking time about freakish behavior, felt less like a threat now, and more like a mockery. 3 days. 3 days since Dudley's hair had turned an alarming shade of green during one of his favorite games, cornering Harry behind the garden shed and demanding his pocket money. Harry hadn't meant for it to happen, hadn't even understood what was happening, until Dudley was shrieking, and Aunt Petunia was screaming, and Uncle Vernon was hauling Harry up the stairs by his too large shirt collar. He sat on the thin mattress that served as his bed, knees drawn up to his chest, and listened to the house settle around him. The lock on his bedroom door was new, a heavy brass thing that clicked with unforgiving finality each time Uncle Vernon turned the key. The bars on his window were newer still, installed just this morning, with a great deal of muttered curses about ungrateful freaks and teaching proper lessons. The Dursleys had left an hour ago for Uncle Vernon's company dinner, their voices bright with anticipation as they bundled Dudley into his best clothes and promised him cake and fizzy drinks. The front door had slammed with the particular weight that meant they wouldn't return until very late, if at all. Sometimes Uncle Vernon's business dinners stretched into overnight stays at fancy hotels, and Aunt Petunia would pack a small bag with her good jewelry and her most hopeful smile. Harry pressed his forehead against his knees and tried not to think about the plate of sandwiches he'd seen Aunt Petunia prepare for Dudley's lunch, or the way his cousin had made a show of eating slowly while staring at Harry through the kitchen window. The water glass by his bed had been empty since yesterday afternoon. His lips felt papery, and when he swallowed, it was like trying to force down cotton. He wanted to live. Oh, how desperately he wanted to live. The thought came unbidden and with such fierce clarity that it surprised him. Not just exist. Live. Actually live, in a way that didn't involve counting the hours between meals or wondering which of his accidental wrongdoings would earn him the cupboard again. Harry stood slowly, testing his balance. 3 days without proper food made his legs feel strange and distant, but determination was a curious thing. It filled the hollow spaces better than bread might have, at least for a little while. The bedroom door was solid oak, installed with all the care Uncle Vernon applied to keeping unwanted things contained. But Harry had been accidentally opening locked doors since he was 6 years old. He'd never understood how it happened. There was never any sound, never any visible change. One moment the lock held fast, and the next it simply didn't. He placed his palm against the wood and thought, very quietly, "Please." The lock clicked open with the soft whisper of metal releasing metal. Harry stared at his hand for a long moment, then at the door, which hung slightly ajar in its frame. The house stretched beyond it, empty and waiting. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen below, the tick of the sitting room clock, the small sounds that houses made when they thought no one was listening. But the window would be safer. Less chance of leaving obvious evidence of his escape. The bars were bolted into the window frame with screws thick as his thumb, but Harry had been making impossible things happen his entire life. He pressed his hands against the cold metal and whispered the same quiet pleas that had worked on the door. This time the magic felt different, warmer, like something inside him had been waiting a very long time to be acknowledged. The bars didn't bend or break. They simply weren't there anymore. Harry blinked at the clear pane of glass, then at his hands, then at the window again. The bars lay on the floor beside his feet, their screws still perfectly threaded, as though they had simply decided to politely remove themselves from their posts. The window opened with barely a whisper. The night air tasted like freedom. Harry had never been outside alone after dark. Uncle Vernon's rules about staying where we can keep an eye on you had been carved into him with all the permanence of stone tablets. But rules, he was beginning to understand, were things other people imposed. They only held power if you let them. The roof sloped gently away from his window, and the trellis that supported Aunt Petunia's climbing roses looked sturdy enough. Harry had always been small for his age, light enough to move quietly when quiet was what kept him safe. He swung one leg over the windowsill, then the other, and found himself perched on the edge of the world he'd known. Little Whinging spread out below him, a collection of identical houses with identical gardens and identical lives. Streetlights cast amber pools that didn't quite touch each other, leaving comfortable shadows between. Harry could see the path his feet would need to take, down the trellis, across the garden, through the gap in the hedge that Dudley used when he wanted to spy on the neighbours. But when his feet touched the pavement, something strange happened. Instead of the careful planning he'd mapped out from above, Harry felt himself turning left instead of right, walking not toward the familiar streets that would lead to the playground or the corner shop, but toward the main road that pointed toward London. His feet seemed to know where they wanted to go. He walked for what felt like hours, though the church clock only chimed twice. The hunger and thirst that had driven him from his room faded into background whispers as something stronger pulled him forward. It wasn't quite a voice, and wasn't quite a feeling, more like a memory of being wanted somewhere. The police car found him just as he was beginning to wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake. Harry heard the engine first, the particular rumble that meant authority and questions and explanations he couldn't possibly give. Panic flooded his system with the cold clarity of absolute need. He pressed himself against the nearest wall and wished, desperately, to be invisible. The wall was older than the others on this street, made of brick instead of concrete, and rough under his palms. As the police car's headlights swept toward him, Harry pushed harder against the bricks, praying they might somehow swallow him whole. One of them did. Harry tumbled backward through solid stone and landed hard on cobblestones that definitely hadn't been there a moment before. The police car drove past, its occupants unaware that anything had happened. Harry lay still for a long moment, staring up at a sky that seemed larger somehow, fuller of possibility. When he sat up, the world had changed completely. The street stretched before him like something from a fairy tale. Shop signs swayed in a breeze that smelled of herbs and metal and something else, something that made his chest tight with recognition he couldn't name. Windows glowed with warm light, and behind the glass, Harry could see things that defied every rule he thought he understood about how the world worked. A cauldron stirred itself in one window. Books fluttered their pages like birds in another. A broomstick swept an invisible floor in a third. Magic. Real, undeniable magic. Harry stood slowly, his legs shaking not from hunger now, but from the weight of understanding. This was why his hair grew back overnight when Aunt Petunia cut it. This was why locked doors opened for him, why he could sometimes make things happen just by wishing hard enough. He wasn't a freak. He was magical. The revelation should have been joy, should have been relief. Instead, it sat heavy in his chest like a stone. Because if this world existed, if there were places where magic was normal and expected, then there had to be a reason why he'd never known about it. Someone had decided he shouldn't. Harry walked deeper into the magical street, past shops with names like Ollivanders and Flourish and Blots, past windows full of things that sparkled and moved and whispered. At the far end of the street stood a white marble building that gleamed even in the darkness, its columns reaching toward the sky with the authority of ages. Above the great bronze doors, carved letters proclaimed, Gringotts Wizarding Bank. Banks meant safety, meant official rules, and people who couldn't simply disappear you without paperwork. Harry had never been inside a bank, but Uncle Vernon spoke of them with the kind of respect reserved for institutions that demanded proper behavior. The bronze doors opened at his touch, revealing a smaller set of doors and a vast marble hall beyond. Harry hesitated at the threshold, suddenly aware of his thin pajamas and bare feet, his unwashed hair and the bruises that mottled his arms like finger paintings. But the creature behind the nearest desk looked up at him with sharp, intelligent eyes that held no judgment, only curiosity. "Lost, are you?" the creature asked. His voice was gravelly but not unkind. Rather late for a young human to be wandering about alone. Harry found his voice, though it came out smaller than he'd hoped. "I'm sorry. I didn't know where else to go." The creature, Goblin, some distant memory supplied, studied him for a long moment. Then his expression shifted to something that might have been concern. "When did you last eat, child?" The question hit Harry like a physical blow. His throat closed around an answer that wanted to be a sob. The goblin stood, moving around the desk with surprising grace. "My name is Griphook, and I think, young human, that you need help that has nothing to do with banking." Harry nodded, not trusting his voice. "Come then. Let's see about getting you sorted out properly." As Harry followed Griphook deeper into the marble halls of Gringotts, he felt something inside him uncoil for the first time in memory. Not relief, exactly, but the faint, fragile beginning of hope. Behind them, the great doors closed with a soft whisper, sealing out the world that had never wanted him and welcoming him into one that might. Chapter 2. The Inheritance Test. Harry had never slept in a bed meant for him. The thought came to him as he woke in the small guest chamber Griphook had provided, morning light filtering through windows that looked out onto something impossible, a vast underground cavern that somehow held the light of dawn. The bed was narrow but comfortable, the blankets clean and warm, and no one had locked the door from the outside. He lay still for a long moment, cataloguing the absence of familiar fears. No footsteps in the corridor that might belong to Uncle Vernon, no shouting from downstairs about breakfast preparations he was forbidden to help with, no tightness in his chest from wondering what he'd done wrong this time. Just quiet and safety, and the strange sensation of having slept without listening. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Master Harry?" Griphook's gravelly voice carried through the door. "If you are awake, there are matters we should discuss. And breakfast, if you are hungry." The word breakfast sent Harry's stomach into a symphony of desperate pleading. He scrambled from the bed, pulling on the clean clothes Griphook had provided, simple but well-made garments that actually fit his small frame, and opened the door to find the goblin waiting with what might have been approval. "Better," Griphook observed, studying Harry's appearance. "You look less like a scarecrow and more like a child today. Come." The breakfast was unlike anything Harry had ever been offered. Fresh bread with butter, eggs prepared exactly as he liked them, juice that tasted of apples and sunshine, and all of it served on plates meant for him, with no commentary about gratitude or deservingness. Griphook watched him eat with the patient attention of someone accustomed to seeing hunger satisfied. "Now then," Griphook said when Harry had finally slowed his desperate consumption, "we should discuss why you came to us, and what we might do to help." Harry set down his fork carefully. "I don't know if I can pay for this. The breakfast or the room or your time. Uncle Vernon always says nothing comes free." Something sharp flickered in Griphook's dark eyes. "Your Uncle Vernon, I suspect, has told you many things that are not true. But we shall return to that shortly. Tell me, Master Harry, what do you know of your parents?" "They died in a car crash when I was a baby." The words came automatically, worn smooth by years of repetition. They were drunk and irresponsible, and they left me with nothing but trouble for my relatives." Griphook was very still for a moment. Then he leaned forward, his expression intense. "And who told you this?" "Uncle Vernon, Aunt Petunia. Everyone knows." Harry stopped, something cold sliding down his spine. "That's not true, is it?" "No," Griphook said quietly. "It is not. Master Harry, would you permit me to conduct what we call an inheritance test? It is a simple magical procedure that reveals family connections, available vaults, and any existing claims on your person or property. In your case, I suspect it might reveal considerably more." Harry nodded, though his throat felt tight. "What do I need to do?" Griphook produced a sheet of parchment that looked ancient and expensive, its surface covered with symbols that seemed to shift when Harry wasn't looking directly at them. From his robes, he withdrew a small silver knife that gleamed with more than reflected light. A single drop of blood on the parchment. The magic will do the rest. The knife was sharp enough that Harry barely felt it. The drop of blood that fell onto the parchment spread like ink in water, but instead of staining, it began to glow. Lines of text appeared in elegant script, filling the page with information that made Griphook's breath hiss between his teeth. "Extraordinary," Griphook murmured, reading rapidly. "And deeply, deeply wrong." Harry tried to read over the goblin's shoulder, but the script kept shifting, rearranging itself as though uncertain how to present its findings. "What does it say?" Griphook set the parchment on the table with the care reserved for explosive devices. "It says, Master Harry, that you are the heir to not one, but multiple ancient families. Potter, Black, and through your mother's line, Evans. Each of these families maintained vaults with us, some for centuries, all of which should be accessible to you as their legitimate heir." The word seemed to echo in Harry's skull without quite making sense. "Vaults? Money, Master Harry. Property. Artifacts of your family's history. Your parents were not poor drunk fools who died in a car crash. They were wealthy, respected members of our community, who died protecting you from something far more dangerous." Harry felt the room tilt slightly, as though the floor had developed an opinion about where it wanted to be. Something more dangerous. But Griphook wasn't finished with the parchment. His dark eyes moved further down the page, and with each line, his expression grew darker. This cannot be." "What?" Griphook's finger traced a section of text that pulsed with red light, as though the parchment itself found the information offensive. "There are magical signatures here, bindings and blocks that should not exist. And most concerning of all, there are documents claiming legal guardianship that bear—" He paused, studying the text more closely. When he spoke again, his voice was deadly quiet. "Master Harry, this parchment shows evidence of forged magical documents, specifically a life debt claim stating that your mother's sister owes her life to your father, and therefore is magically compelled to accept guardianship of you." Harry blinked, trying to process words that felt slippery and strange. "A life debt?" "A magical bond formed when one person saves another's life. It creates an obligation that must be repaid. But Master Harry—" Griphook's claws tapped against the table with increasing agitation. "Your father never saved Petunia Dursley's life. This document is a fabrication, created to provide false legal justification for your placement with your relatives." The cold feeling in Harry's stomach spread outward, creeping up his spine like ice water. Someone forged it. Someone with significant magical power and knowledge of goblin banking law. Griphook's voice carried the particular fury reserved for violations of sacred trust. Someone who wanted you placed with the Dursleys badly enough to commit banking fraud to accomplish it. Harry stared at the parchment, its red glowing text seeming to mock him with its existence. "But why would anyone want me to live there? It's horrible." "That," Griphook said grimly, is a question I very much intend to find answered." He stood abruptly, the parchment crackling in his grip. "Master Harry, there is more. The inheritance test shows magical blocks on your core, spells designed to limit your natural abilities. There are also tracking charms, placed without your knowledge or consent. You have been monitored and suppressed since infancy." Each word hit Harry like a physical blow. "Someone's been watching me. Someone has been controlling you." Griphook's eyes blazed with righteous indignation. "Your magical development has been deliberately stunted, your location constantly monitored, and your placement with abusive relatives justified through fraudulent documentation. This is not guardianship, Master Harry. This is orchestrated suffering." Harry's hands began to shake, and not from hunger this time. The careful walls he'd built around his understanding of the world were crumbling, revealing vistas of possibility and betrayal he'd never imagined. Who would do this? Griphook studied the magical signature at the bottom of the forged documents, his expression growing more grim by the moment. The magical signature here belongs to Albus Dumbledore, Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, and Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards. The name meant nothing to Harry, but Griphook spoke it with the kind of weight reserved for important people. "He's powerful?" "One of the most powerful wizards alive," Griphook confirmed. "Widely regarded as a champion of light and justice. And according to this evidence, personally responsible for every day of suffering you have endured." Harry felt something crack inside his chest, like a door he'd never known existed finally giving way. Behind it lay not relief but a vast, yawning anger that threatened to consume everything he thought he understood about fairness and justice and the way the world worked. "He did this on purpose," Harry whispered. "All of it. So it appears." Griphook rolled the parchment carefully, his movements sharp with controlled fury. "Master Harry, I am going to contact my superiors. What has been done to you violates not only basic decency, but also several international treaties governing magical guardianship and banking law. This cannot be allowed to stand." Harry nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was agreeing to. The revelation that his entire life had been a lie sat in his stomach like swallowed glass, cutting him from the inside with every breath. "What happens now?" Griphook's smile was all teeth and sharp edges. "Now, Master Harry, we begin the process of setting things right. Starting with removing those blocks on your magic, and ending with ensuring that those responsible for your suffering face the full weight of goblin justice." He paused at the chamber door, looking back at Harry with something that might have been gentle concern beneath the fury. "I know this is overwhelming, but I want you to understand something. You are not alone anymore, and you are not powerless." After Griphook left, Harry sat in the silence of the guest chamber and tried to absorb the magnitude of what he'd learned. His parents hadn't been drunk fools. They'd been wealthy, respected, murdered, trying to protect him. His relatives hadn't taken him in out of reluctant duty. They'd been coerced through forged magical documents, and somewhere in the world was a man named Albus Dumbledore who had orchestrated Harry's suffering with the same careful attention other people might apply to planning a garden party. The anger was still there, burning bright and clean in his chest. But underneath it, growing stronger with each breath, was something else. Something that felt like hope armed with sharp teeth. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was not afraid. Outside his window, the impossible underground dawn continued to shine, and in the depths of Gringotts Bank, the wheels of justice began their slow, inexorable turn. Chapter 3. The Goblin Council. The sound of multiple sets of claws clicking against marble floors woke Harry from the first dreamless sleep he could remember having. Through the thick stone walls of his guest chamber, he could hear voices speaking in what must have been gobbledygook, rapid, guttural sounds that carried the weight of urgent business. He dressed quickly in the clothes Griphook had provided and stepped into the corridor to find the normally quiet halls of Gringotts humming with activity. Goblins moved with purpose between chambers, their expressions grim and their voices low. Whatever Harry's inheritance test had revealed, it had stirred something far larger than a simple banking matter. Griphook appeared at his elbow, as though summoned by thought. "Master Harry, Director Ragnok has arrived and wishes to speak with you. Are you ready?" Harry nodded, though ready felt like an inadequate word for whatever was about to happen. Griphook led him through corridors he hadn't seen before, past chambers filled with more goblins than Harry had known existed. They all looked up as he passed, their dark eyes following him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something that looked disturbingly like pity. The chamber they entered was vast and circular, its walls lined with towering shelves of documents that seemed to stretch up into shadows. At the center sat a massive desk carved from what looked like a single piece of black stone, and behind it waited a goblin who made Griphook look almost delicate by comparison. Director Ragnok was ancient, even by goblin standards, his face a map of lines, earned through centuries of navigating the treacherous waters between goblin law and wizard politics. When he looked at Harry, his eyes held depths that spoke of having seen enough injustice to fill several lifetimes. "Master Potter," Ragnok said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." Harry took the chair indicated, trying not to show how small it made him feel in the enormous chamber. Around the edges of the room, other goblins had gathered. Some Harry recognized from the banking floor, others whose elaborate robes suggested positions of significant importance. "Griphook has briefed me on your situation," Ragnok continued, "and I have spent the morning conducting additional magical analysis. What we have discovered is far more serious than a simple case of fraudulent documentation." He gestured, and the inheritance parchment from the day before appeared on the desk between them, along with several others Harry didn't recognize. All of them glowed with that same ominous red light. "These documents," Ragnok said, his claws tapping against each parchment in turn, "represent a systematic violation of magical law that spans nearly a decade. Forged guardianship papers, fabricated life debt claims, illegal magical bindings placed on a minor without consent or proper legal justification." Harry tried to follow the implications, but the words felt too large and official to apply to his small, ordinary life. "I don't understand. Why would someone go to all this trouble?" "An excellent question," Ragnok replied, "and one that grows more disturbing the deeper we investigate. Tell me, Master Potter, what do you know of magical guardianship law?" "Nothing," Harry admitted. "I don't know anything about magical anything." Something that might have been approval flickered in Ragnok's ancient eyes. "Honesty. A rare commodity in this matter, it seems. Allow me to educate you." He stood, moving to a shelf that held volumes thick as bricks. "Under magical law, a child who loses their parents has several protections. First, any existing will-naming guardians must be honored. Second, if no will exists, guardianship must be awarded to the family member most capable of providing magical education and proper care. Third, if no suitable family exists, the child is placed with a magical family through the Department of Magical Child Welfare." Each word hit Harry like a small stone thrown with precision. "My parents had a will?" "Indeed they did." Ragnok pulled a document from the collection, this one glowing with pure white light. "James and Lily Potter named specific guardians for you in the event of their deaths. None of those guardians were your mother's sister." Harry stared at the parchment, trying to make sense of script that seemed to swim before his eyes. "Then why?" "Because someone with significant power and influence decided that the law didn't suit their purposes," Ragnok said grimly. "The will was hidden. The proper guardians were never contacted. Instead, you were placed with relatives who had no legal claim to you. using forged documentation to justify the placement. Griphook stepped forward, his expression dark with professional outrage. Director, we've also discovered that the blood wards used to justify the placement were not created through willing magical sacrifice. Ah, yes. The blood wards. Ragnar's voice carried a particular venom reserved for violations of ancient magic. Master Potter, you have been told, I assume, that your mother's sacrifice created powerful protection that could only be maintained by living with her blood relatives? Harry nodded mutely. Another lie. While your mother's sacrifice did indeed create protection, that protection was bound to you, not to a location. The blood wards at Privet Drive were created separately, through coercive magic that forced your aunt to accept you despite her wishes. They are not powered by love or willing sacrifice, but by magical compulsion that treats your aunt as little more than a magical anchor. The room seemed to tilt around Harry as the implications crashed over him. Aunt Petunia didn't want me there? Your aunt was magically compelled to keep you, using forged life debt documentation as justification. She has been as much a victim of this deception as you have. Harry thought of all the years of resentment, the bitter words about freaks and abnormality, the way Aunt Petunia flinched whenever accidental magic happened around him. She was being forced by someone who cared nothing for the well-being of either a child or the woman compelled to raise him. Ragnar's claws scraped against stone with barely contained fury. Master Potter, what has been done to you violates not only magical law, but also several international treaties governing the protection of magical children. More than that, it violates the sacred trust between the Goblin Nation and the wizarding world regarding banking confidentiality and client protection. Harry looked around the chamber at the assembled goblins, all of whom watched him with expressions of grim determination. What does that mean? It means, said a new voice from the chamber entrance, that Gringotts Bank is prepared to go to war over this. The goblin who entered was smaller than Ragnar, but carried himself with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest being in any room. His robes bore symbols that hurt to look at directly, and when he moved, the very air seemed to pay attention. Master Potter, Ragnar said, allow me to introduce Gornuk, our chief legal advisor. He has been reviewing the treaty implications of your case. Gornuk bowed with the precise formality reserved for matters of international law. Master Potter, under the Treaty of Magical Banking, established in 1682, any attempt to defraud or coerce a Gringotts client constitutes an act of aggression against the Goblin Nation itself. The magical signatures on these forged documents belong to Albus Dumbledore, currently serving as Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, the same body that would normally oversee magical guardianship disputes, Griphook added quietly. Harry felt a cold understanding creep up his spine. He's in charge of the people who are supposed to protect children like me. Precisely, Gornuk confirmed, a conflict of interest so profound that it constitutes systematic corruption. Master Potter, we have uncovered evidence that suggests this is not an isolated incident. Other children may have been placed inappropriately, other families manipulated, all under the authority of someone who should have been their ultimate protection. The weight of it threatened to crush Harry where he sat. His entire life hadn't just been a lie. It had been part of something larger, something that had hurt other children too. What can you do? Director Ragnar leaned forward, his ancient eyes blazing with righteous purpose. We can do what goblins have always done when faced with injustice, Master Potter. We can ensure that those responsible face the consequences of their actions. Gornuk, what are our legal options? Extensive, Gornuk replied with satisfaction that bordered on predatory. We can formally charge Albus Dumbledore with banking fraud, treaty violations, child endangerment, and conspiracy to commit magical coercion. We can demand a full investigation of all his decisions regarding magical child placement. and we can invoke our right under goblin law to provide sanctuary to any client whose safety has been compromised by wizard malfeasance." "Sanctuary?" Harry's voice came out smaller than he intended. "You would remain here, under goblin protection, while the investigation proceeds," Ragnok explained gently. "No wizard authority could compel your return to unsafe conditions. No one could force you back into the situation that has caused you so much harm." The offer hung in the air like sunlight after months of darkness. Safety, real safety, backed by law and treaty and the kind of institutional power that didn't bend to individual whim. "But there would be consequences," Harry said, because Uncle Vernon had taught him that nothing good came without a price. "Indeed, there would be." Ragnok's smile was all teeth and sharp edges. "The wizarding world would learn that their hero, their symbol of light and justice, has spent the last decade systematically abusing a child for purposes known only to himself. The political implications alone would shake their government to its foundations. And if they try to retaliate against you for protecting me, then they will discover why goblins have maintained their independence for over 1,000 years, Gornuk said with quiet menace. "We do not yield to wizard intimidation, Master Potter. We especially do not yield when the law is on our side." Harry looked around the chamber, at faces that had gone from strangers to allies in the span of 2 days. Griphook's encouraging nod, Ragnok's ancient certainty, Gornuk's legal precision, all of them prepared to stand between him and the forces that had shaped his life into something smaller and more painful than it needed to be. "What do I need to do?" "Simply say yes," Ragnok replied. "Accept our sanctuary, and allow us to begin the process of ensuring justice is served." Harry thought of Privet Drive, of the cupboard under the stairs, of 9 years spent believing he deserved nothing better than the smallest portion of whatever was left over. Then he thought of this chamber, of breakfast served on proper plates, of adults who looked at him and saw someone worth protecting rather than tolerating. "Yes," he said, and the word felt like stepping through a door he hadn't known existed. "Yes, please." The change in the room was immediate and profound. Goblins who had been watching with cautious hope now moved with the sharp efficiency of a military operation. Scrolls appeared as if summoned. Quills began writing with supernatural speed. Seals were pressed into wax with the weight of institutional authority behind them. "Then it is done," Ragnok declared, his voice carrying across the chamber with the finality of a judge's gavel. "Master Harry Potter is now under the formal protection of Gringotts Bank and the Goblin Nation. Let any who would challenge this protection come forward and face the consequences of their actions." As activity swirled around him, Harry sat quietly in his chair and marveled at how different the world could look when viewed from a place of safety. Outside these walls, powerful people were about to discover that even they were not above the law. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was not afraid of what tomorrow might bring. He was looking forward to it. Chapter 4. The Howler's Aftermath. Vernon Dursley prided himself on being a man who anticipated problems before they occurred. It was this careful attention to detail that had made him successful in the drill business, and it was the same methodical thinking that told him something was wrong the moment they pulled into the driveway at number 4, Privet Drive. The house looked exactly as they had left it. Garden tidy, windows clean, everything in its proper place. But there was something in the quality of the silence that made the hair on his neck stand up in a way that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. "Mummy, can I have another piece of cake when we get inside?" Dudley asked from the back seat, still bouncing with excitement from the company dinner. He'd charmed Mr. Grunning's wife by remembering to say please and thank you, and had been rewarded with enough sweets to keep him vibrating with sugar for hours. "Of course, Dudders," Petunia said absently, but Vernon noticed the way her eyes were fixed on the upstairs windows, specifically on the window that belonged to the boys' room, the window that should have had bars across it. "Petunia," Vernon said quietly, his hand still on the car keys. "Those bars, "I see them," she whispered. "Vernon, they're on the ground, in the garden." They stared up at the window in the gathering dusk, both of them thinking the same impossible thing. The bars had been bolted into the window frame that very morning, with screws that would have required power tools to remove. There was no way a 9-year-old boy could have... "Where's Harry?" Dudley asked, pressing his nose against the car window. "Why isn't he looking out his window? He always looks out when we come home." Vernon's stomach dropped toward his shoes. "Stay in the car," he told his family, though his voice came out strangled and thin. "Both of you. Stay in the car until I come back." The front door opened easily, too easily, because Vernon had locked it himself before they left. Inside, the house felt hollow in a way that went beyond simple emptiness. It felt abandoned. He took the stairs 2 at a time, though part of him wanted to turn around and drive away and pretend they'd never come home at all. The door to the boys' room hung open, which was impossible because Vernon had locked it himself with the new deadbolt he'd installed specifically to prevent escapes. The room was empty. Completely, utterly empty. The window gaped open to the night air, its missing bars lying in the garden below like an accusation. The bed was unmade but not slept in. The water glass he'd left, empty because 3 days was barely long enough to teach proper lessons about freakish behavior, sat untouched on the small table. Vernon stood in the doorway and felt his carefully ordered world begin to crumble around the edges. The boy was gone. The freakish, impossible, ungrateful boy had somehow vanished from a locked room with barred windows, and there was no rational explanation for how it could have happened. More terrifying still was what this meant. If the boy had run off and told someone about how he'd been treated, if the wrong sort of people found out what the Dursleys had been required to do. "Vernon," Petunia's voice drifted up from downstairs, tight with barely controlled panic. "Vernon, there's an owl at the kitchen window." By the time Vernon made it back downstairs, Petunia had already opened the window and taken the letter from the enormous tawny owl that had delivered it. Her hands shook as she unfolded the parchment, and her face went white as she read. "What does it say?" Vernon demanded. Petunia cleared her throat and read in a voice that grew smaller with each word. "Mrs. Dursley, I must speak with you immediately regarding your nephew's whereabouts. He has not been where he was supposed to be for the past 24 hours, and this is a matter of utmost urgency. I will arrive at 8 o'clock this evening. Albus Dumbledore." Vernon checked his watch. 7:58. "Dudley," Petunia said, her voice pitched with the kind of false calm that fooled no one. "Go upstairs and play in your room. Don't come down until we call for you." "But I want my cake." "Now, Dudley." Something in his mother's tone must have penetrated even Dudley's sugar-addled brain, because he trudged upstairs without further argument. Vernon heard his bedroom door close just as the doorbell rang with the particular authority that belonged to people accustomed to being obeyed. The man on their doorstep looked exactly like what he was. A wizard. Tall and thin, with long silver hair and a beard that belonged in fairy tales, wearing robes that seemed to shimmer in the porch light. His eyes, behind half-moon spectacles, were the kind of blue that seemed to see through walls and excuses and carefully constructed lies. "Mrs. Dursley," he said, inclining his head in a gesture that managed to be polite and threatening at the same time. "Mr. Dursley, may I come in?" Vernon wanted to say no. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to slam the door and pretend this wasn't happening. But the memory of 10 years of letters, polite letters that somehow managed to convey what would happen if the instructions they contained were not followed, kept him frozen in place. "Of course," Petunia said, stepping aside with the mechanical courtesy of someone whose choices had been made for them long ago. Dumbledore followed them into the sitting room, his eyes taking in every detail with the thoroughness of someone conducting an inspection. When his gaze lingered on the cat flap that had been nailed shut, the one that had once been used to pass food scraps to the boy when he'd been kept in the cupboard under the stairs, Vernon felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Where is Harry?" Dumbledore asked without preamble. "We don't know," Petunia said, wrapping her arms around herself as though trying to hold something together. "We went to Vernon's company dinner, and when we came back, he was gone." "Gone how?" Vernon found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "The door was locked. I locked it myself. The window had bars, new ones installed this morning. But when we came home—" "The bars were removed," Dumbledore finished, and something in his tone suggested this was not entirely unexpected. "Show me." The trip upstairs felt like a march to execution. Vernon led the way to the boys' room, acutely aware of how small it looked, how bare, how obviously designed to contain rather than comfort. Dumbledore stood in the doorway for a long moment, his expression growing darker with each detail he absorbed. "How long was he locked in here?" he asked quietly. 3 days, Petunia said, the words coming out in a rush. He'd done something freakish again, made Dudley's hair change colours, and Vernon thought, you thought 3 days without food or water would teach him better control. Dumbledore's voice was very soft, which somehow made it more frightening than shouting would have been. "You said we had to treat him normally," Vernon burst out, his fear finally overriding his caution. "You said we had to make sure he didn't get ideas above his station, didn't think he was special. You said—" "I said many things," Dumbledore interrupted. "But I do not recall instructing you to starve a child." The silence that followed stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Vernon felt sweat gathering at his collar, despite the cool evening air coming through the open window. "The life debt," Petunia whispered suddenly. "You said I owed James Potter my life. You said the magic wouldn't work unless I truly accepted responsibility for Harry. And have you?" Dumbledore asked. "Accepted responsibility?" Petunia's laugh had a hysterical edge to it. "Responsibility? We've been prisoners in our own home for 10 years. Every time we tried to treat him like a normal child, those letters would come. Instructions about how he needed to be kept humble, kept ignorant, kept from thinking he was anything special. And if we didn't follow them exactly—" She trailed off, but Vernon remembered the letters too. The ones that came after they'd tried to send the boy to a state school. The ones that explained, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, what happened to people who interfered with Albus Dumbledore's plans. "You were compelled," Dumbledore said, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he looked less certain of himself. "The magic that protects Harry requires genuine care, genuine acceptance. If you were acting under compulsion—" He pulled a thin wooden stick from his robes and waved it in the air above the room. Sparks of light cascaded from its tip, swirling around the small space before settling into patterns that made Vernon's eyes water to look at directly. When the light faded, Dumbledore's face had gone pale. "The blood wards," he murmured, more to himself than to them. "They're not anchored in love. They're anchored in—" He turned to Petunia with eyes that seemed to see her properly for the first time in years. "Mrs. Dursley, when you agreed to take Harry, were you given a choice? A real choice?" Petunia's voice came out in a whisper. "You said if I didn't take him, he would die. You said Lily's sacrifice would be wasted, and it would be my fault. You said the life debt meant I didn't have a choice. The life debt that never existed," Dumbledore said quietly, and Vernon saw something that looked like recognition dawn in the old wizard's eyes. The life debt that was created specifically to justify placing Harry with people who would ensure he grew up humble and grateful for any kindness shown to him. Vernon felt the world tilt around him as the implications crashed home. "You mean we didn't have to?" "No," Dumbledore said, and for the first time, his voice carried something that might have been regret. "You never had to do any of it. The life debt was a fabrication designed to create the appearance of legal justification for a placement that served no one's interests but my own." The sitting room fell silent, except for the sound of Petunia crying and Vernon's harsh breathing. Upstairs, they could hear Dudley moving around his room, blissfully unaware that the foundation of his family's entire existence had just crumbled to dust. "Where is he now?" Dumbledore asked eventually. "We don't know," Vernon said again. "The tracking charm has been severed," Dumbledore finished grimly, "by someone with considerable knowledge of magical concealment. Tell me, in the time since you returned home, have you received any other correspondence? Any official notices?" Vernon shook his head, but Petunia had gone very still. "There was another owl," she said slowly, "just before you arrived. I thought it was from you, so I didn't." She pulled a second letter from her apron pocket, this one bearing an official-looking seal that seemed to shift and change when Vernon looked at it directly. Dumbledore took it from her with hands that trembled slightly, broke the seal, and read. With each line, his expression grew darker. "What does it say?" Petunia asked. Dumbledore folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his robes. "It says, Mrs. Dursley, that Harry Potter has been placed under the formal protection of Gringotts Wizarding Bank, pending an investigation into his improper placement with your family." Vernon felt the last of his strength leave him. He sank into his armchair and put his head in his hands. "We're in trouble, aren't we?" "We are all in trouble, Mr. Dursley," Dumbledore said quietly. "But perhaps that is not entirely a bad thing." Miles away in the depths of Gringotts Bank, Harry Potter sat in comfortable pajamas and ate his second proper meal in as many days. Across from him, Griphook continued the education that should have begun years ago, explaining the difference between blood protection, freely given, and magical coercion, disguised as guardianship. "Your parents," Griphook said, cutting another slice of the cake that had appeared to mark Harry's birthday, "were known for their kindness, but they were not naive. They would never have wanted you to suffer for the sake of protection that could have been achieved through other means." Harry accepted the cake, chocolate with real icing and everything, and marveled at how different the same day could feel when experienced from a place of safety. What were they really like? James Potter was stubborn and brilliant and fiercely loyal to his friends. Lily Evans was clever and compassionate and utterly fearless when defending those she loved. Together, they were formidable. And they really left instructions about who should take care of me. They did indeed. Extensive instructions that were ignored in favor of a placement that served the political purposes of someone who cared more about controlling your future than ensuring your happiness. Harry took another bite of cake and tried to imagine what his life might have been like if those instructions had been followed. It was hard to picture, so hard that it felt like trying to imagine having wings or breathing underwater. But here in the safety of Gringotts, surrounded by people who seemed to value his well-being for its own sake, he was beginning to think that imagining a different life might not be impossible after all. Outside the guest quarters, goblin justice was in motion, and Harry Potter was no longer anyone's victim. For the first time in 10 years, that was exactly as it should be. Chapter 5. Allies Emerge. Amelia Bones had built her career on the principle that truth, once properly excavated, was always more interesting than fiction. As head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, she had seen enough creative interpretations of legal procedure to recognize genuine irregularities when they crossed her desk. The formal letter from Gringotts Bank that arrived with the Morning Post was irregular in ways that made her reach for her strongest coffee before attempting to pass its implications. "Director," she said to her assistant through the open office door, "cancel my morning appointments and send for the archives on child welfare cases from 1981. All of them." The letter was written in the precise legal language that goblins favored when they were preparing to declare war. References to treaty violations, banking fraud, and systematic child endangerment were woven through formal requests for investigation with the kind of deadly politeness that suggested someone was about to discover just how expensive it was to cross goblin interests. But it was the name at the center of the complaint that made Amelia's hands still on the parchment. Harry Potter, the boy who lived. The child who had supposedly been living safely with his relatives while the wizarding world celebrated his victory over you-know-who. According to the Goblins, Harry Potter had been systematically abused for nearly a decade, placed with relatives through fraudulent documentation, and subjected to magical suppression that violated every law governing the treatment of magical children. And the magical signature on the forged documents belonged to Albus Dumbledore. Amelia set the letter aside and rubbed her temples. In her 15 years of law enforcement, she had learned to be suspicious of convenient truths and comfortable lies. The story of Harry Potter's peaceful childhood with loving relatives had always felt too neat, too perfect for a world that specialized in complicated, messy realities. The archives arrived 20 minutes later, carried by 2 junior aurors who staggered under the weight of files that should have been much smaller. Amelia spread them across her office floor and began the methodical work of excavation. What she found made her stomach turn. Reports, dozens of them, anonymous tips about a child being kept in a cupboard, concerned neighbor observations about bars on windows and a boy who looked too thin, teacher reports about a student who fell asleep in class and flinched when adults moved too quickly. Every single report had been filed, investigated, and dismissed. The investigating officer's notes were identical in each case. Child appears well cared for. No evidence of mistreatment. Recommend case closure. But the handwriting was wrong. The magical signatures were wrong. And when Amelia cross-referenced the supposed investigative dates with duty rosters, half of the investigating officers had been assigned to other cases in entirely different counties. Someone had been systematically burying evidence of Harry Potter's abuse for 9 years, and that someone had enough influence to falsify official reports, manipulate duty assignments, and ensure that no investigation ever reached a conclusion that might require actual intervention. Amelia reached for her emergency flu powder. There were people who needed to know about this immediately. At Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Deputy Headmistress Minerva McGonagall was having what might charitably be described as a difficult morning. The request had arrived through official channels, a Goblin Educational Liaison inquiry regarding the academic preparation of one Harry James Potter for potential early enrollment procedures. Standard bureaucratic language that barely concealed the implication that someone was questioning whether Hogwarts was prepared to accommodate a student whose previous education had been deliberately sabotaged. McGonagall had taught for 30 years. She knew the difference between a routine inquiry and a formal challenge to institutional competence. More troubling still was her growing certainty that she had no idea what Harry Potter's current educational status actually was. She had been told, by Dumbledore, always by Dumbledore, that the boy was thriving with his aunt and uncle. Well loved, properly cared for, growing up normal and happy away from the pressures of celebrity. But when she tried to recall the source of that information, she realized it had always been second-hand. Dumbledore's assurances, delivered with the comfortable authority of someone who had personally verified the facts. McGonagall made her way through the castle corridors with the particular stride that suggested someone was about to have a very unpleasant conversation. She found Dumbledore in his office, surrounded by the usual collection of whirring instruments and sleeping portraits, looking every inch the wise and benevolent leader of magical education. "Albus," she said without preamble, "I've received an inquiry from Gringotts regarding Harry Potter's educational preparation. They seem to be under the impression that his previous schooling has been inadequate." Something flickered behind Dumbledore's half-moon spectacles. "I'm sure it's nothing to be concerned about, Minerva. A simple misunderstanding. They're asking about remedial programs for children who have been educationally neglected," McGonagall interrupted. "They want to know if we have provisions for students who may be significantly behind their age group due to deliberate educational sabotage." The silence that followed was loud enough to wake several of the portraits, who stirred restlessly in their frames before settling back into diplomatic sleep. "Minerva," Dumbledore said carefully, "what exactly do you know about Harry's current circumstances?" "I know what you've told me," McGonagall replied, and her voice carried the particular chill reserved for students caught in blatant deceptions. "That he's happy and well cared for with his aunt and uncle, that they love him and want what's best for him, that he's growing up normal and unaffected by his fame. And what does Gringotts suggest otherwise?" McGonagall pulled the goblin letter from her robes and read directly from it. "Educational assessment requested for minor child currently under goblin protection due to evidence of systematic abuse, magical suppression, and fraudulent guardianship documentation." Each word fell into the office silence, like stones dropped into deep water. Dumbledore aged visibly as the implications settled around them. "Under goblin protection," he repeated quietly. "Albus," McGonagall said, and her voice was very soft now, very dangerous. "What have you done?" Before Dumbledore could answer, green flames erupted in his fireplace, and Severus Snape stepped through with the particular scowl he reserved for interruptions to his carefully planned brewing schedule. "Headmaster," Snape said, brushing flue powder from his black robes, "your message said this was urgent. I have 3 potions that require hourly monitoring." He stopped mid-sentence, taking in McGonagall's thunderous expression and Dumbledore's uncharacteristic pallor. "What's happened?" "It seems," McGonagall said with deadly precision, "that Harry Potter has not been living the comfortable, pampered life we were led to believe. According to Gringotts Bank, he has spent the last 9 years being systematically abused by relatives who were coerced into taking him through fraudulent magical documentation." Snape went very still. "What do you mean, systematically abused?" Dumbledore cleared his throat. "Severus, you must understand. The blood protection required." "What do you mean, systematically abused?" Snape repeated, and his voice carried the particular coldness that usually preceded the assignment of truly spectacular detentions. McGonagall consulted the goblin letter again. "Kept in a cupboard. Starved. Locked in rooms for days at a time. Subjected to magical suppression charms to prevent accidental magic. Told his parents were drunk fools who died in a car crash." The colour drained from Snape's sallow face. "A cupboard? Under the stairs, apparently." Snape turned to Dumbledore with an expression that would have sent first-year students fleeing for the safety of their dormitories. "You told me he was spoiled. You said his relatives doted on him. You said he was growing up arrogant and entitled, just like his father." "The blood protection," Dumbledore began again. "The blood protection required him to be loved," Snape interrupted, his voice climbing toward the register usually reserved for students who had just exploded their cauldrons. "You told me yourself that Lily's sacrifice only worked because it was freely given out of love. How does systematic abuse factor into that equation?" McGonagall looked between them with the expression of someone watching a particularly important puzzle piece slide into place. "Severus," she said slowly, "how long have you believed that Harry Potter was being spoiled by his relatives?" "Since his placement there," Snape replied, still staring at Dumbledore with unconcealed fury. "The headmaster assured me that the boy would grow up coddled and indulged. He said it was necessary to ensure Harry didn't develop an inflated sense of his own importance before attending Hogwarts." "And you've spent 10 years hating a child because you believed he was living in luxury while you remembered his mother's sacrifice?" Snape's silence was answer enough. McGonagall turned back to Dumbledore with an expression that could have melted steel. "Albus Dumbledore, what exactly have you done?" Across London, in a small but comfortable house in Islington, Andromeda Tonks, née Black, was learning that being disowned from one's family did not necessarily exempt one from family obligations. The letter had arrived by Goblin post, which was unusual enough to warrant immediate attention. Letters delivered by Goblin messengers typically concerned matters of significant legal or financial importance, and Andromeda had learned long ago to treat such communications with appropriate seriousness. The contents, however, were beyond anything she could have anticipated. As the last surviving member of the Black family, not currently imprisoned or deceased, she was being notified of inheritance claims involving the ancient and noble House of Black. Specifically, claims involving one Harry James Potter, whose blood connection to the Black family through his paternal grandmother entitled him to access certain family vaults and properties. More disturbing still was the context provided for this notification. The child in question had been placed under formal goblin protection due to evidence of systematic abuse and fraudulent guardianship documentation. Andromeda set the letter on her kitchen table and stared at it for a long moment. Harry Potter, James Potter's son, the boy who lived, supposedly safe and happy with his mother's family. She remembered James Potter from her Hogwarts years, arrogant and loud and utterly devoted to his friends, and the girl who would eventually become his wife. She remembered the wedding announcement, the birth announcement, the devastating news of their deaths. And she remembered thinking, in the weeks that followed, that it was strange how completely the child had vanished from public view. No photographs, no updates, no appearances at the memorial services held in his parents' honor. Just assurances from official sources that he was safe and well cared for, away from the spotlight. Andromeda had accepted those assurances because she had wanted to believe that someone, somewhere, was ensuring that James and Lily Potter's son was growing up, loved and protected. She had enough experience with her own family's particular cruelties to understand what happened to children who were seen as burdens rather than blessings. The goblin letter suggested that her faith had been tragically misplaced. She reached for her quill and began composing a response. If Harry Potter was truly a Black family heir, then he had family available who understood what it meant to choose love over obligation, protection over politics. It was time someone made sure the boy knew that. At Gringotts Bank, Harry Potter sat in the library that Griphook had shown him that morning, surrounded by books about magical lore and goblin customs and the true history of the wizarding world's relationship with magical creatures. The reading was difficult. His education at Little Whinging Primary had been adequate but hardly comprehensive. But Harry found himself hungry for knowledge in a way that felt almost physical. "Master Harry," Griphook said, appearing at his elbow with the particular quiet that goblins cultivated when approaching someone deep in thought. "There are some people who would like to meet you, adults who knew your parents, who have been asking after your welfare for some time." Harry looked up from the book he'd been struggling through, something about international treaties and magical child protection laws. "People who knew my parents?" "People who cared about them," Griphook confirmed. "People who would have been caring about you as well, if they had known you needed caring for." Harry marked his place in the book and stood. For the first time in his life, the prospect of meeting new adults didn't fill him with dread. After all, he was no longer anyone's unwanted burden. He was a goblin-protected client with inheritance rights and people who were prepared to fight for his welfare. The difference, Harry was beginning to understand, was everything. Chapter 6. The Magical Education. Harry had never been good at school, but he was beginning to suspect that might have had less to do with his abilities and more to do with the schools themselves. The goblin tutors that Griphook had arranged were unlike any teachers Harry had encountered. They didn't seem to expect failure, didn't flinch when he asked questions, and most remarkably, they appeared genuinely pleased when he demonstrated understanding, rather than irritated that he required explanation. "Magic," explained Iron Hand, an elderly goblin whose fingers were stained permanently black from decades of handling enchanted metals, "is not simply about waving a wand and hoping for the best. It is about understanding the fundamental forces that shape our world and learning to work in harmony with them rather than against them." Harry sat cross-legged on a cushion in one of Gringotts' smaller chambers, a space that had been converted into something resembling a classroom. Books lay open around him, real books, with his name written inside the front cover in careful script that proclaimed them his own property. The novelty of owning books still made his chest feel tight with something that might have been happiness. "But how do you know if you're working in harmony with magic?" Harry asked. "How do you know if you're doing it right?" Iron Hand's smile revealed teeth that had been shaped by centuries of careful metalwork. "An excellent question. In your case, young Potter, we can demonstrate quite easily. Griphook, if you would." Griphook appeared at Harry's elbow with a piece of parchment that glowed faintly in the chamber's lamplight. "This is your magical signature, as it appeared 3 days ago, when you first arrived." Harry studied the parchment, trying to make sense of the swirling patterns that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. To his untrained eye, they looked chaotic and somehow constrained, as though something had been wound too tightly and was trying to break free. "And this," Iron Hand said, producing a second piece of parchment, "is your magical signature this morning." The difference was striking even to Harry's inexperienced gaze. Where the first signature had been cramped and erratic, the second flowed in smooth, confident lines that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. "What changed?" Harry asked. "The suppression charms have been removed," Griphook explained. "Your magical core is no longer being artificially constrained. This is what your magic looks like when it is allowed to develop naturally." Harry stared at the second parchment, trying to absorb the implications. "You mean my magic was being held back on purpose?" "Deliberately and systematically," Iron Hand confirmed, with the particular grimness that goblins reserved for discussions of criminal negligence. "Someone wanted to ensure that your natural abilities developed as slowly as possible. The question we must now address is why." Before Harry could formulate a response, a soft knock interrupted their lesson. Griphook moved to the chamber entrance and returned with a woman whose presence seemed to change the very quality of the air. She was perhaps 40, with dark hair streaked with silver and eyes that held the particular weariness of someone who had seen more than their fair share of family disappointment. But when she looked at Harry, her expression softened into something that might have been recognition. "Master Harry," Griphook said with unusual formality, "allow me to present Andromeda Tonks. She has requested the honor of meeting you." Harry stood uncertainly, unsure of the proper etiquette for meeting relatives he hadn't known existed. "Mrs. Tonks?" "Harry," she said, and her voice carried a warmth that made something unclench in his chest. "May I sit with you? There are things about your family, our family, that I think you should know." Iron Hand and Griphook exchanged glances and quietly withdrew, leaving Harry alone with the first blood relative who had ever looked at him as though his existence might be a gift rather than an obligation. "I was born Andromeda Black," she said, settling onto a cushion across from him with practiced grace, "which makes me your father's cousin, and your second cousin by blood. I was disowned from the family long before you were born, but the goblin inheritance laws recognize blood connections regardless of political disagreements." Harry tried to process this information alongside everything else he was learning about the wizarding world's complicated approach to family relationships. "Why were you disowned?" "Because I married a man my family disapproved of," Andromeda replied with a slight smile. "A muggle-born wizard named Ted Tonks. We have a daughter, Nymphadora, who would be your third cousin. She's a few years older than you, just finished her first year at Hogwarts." The word cousin sent an unexpected warmth through Harry's chest. He had family, real family, who seemed genuinely pleased to acknowledge the connection. "The thing is, Harry," Andromeda continued, "I've been wondering for years what happened to James and Lily's son. Your father and I weren't close. The Black family politics made that impossible. But I knew him well enough to know that he and Lily would never have wanted you to grow up isolated from people who cared about your well-being." "They left instructions," Harry said quietly. "Griphook told me they wrote down who they wanted to take care of me if something happened to them." Something sharp flickered in Andromeda's eyes. And those instructions were ignored? They were hidden? Griphook found them yesterday when he was looking through all the legal documents. My parents named 2 people who were supposed to be my guardians if they died. Who? Harry consulted the notes he'd been taking during his lessons with the goblin tutors. Sirius Black, and if he couldn't do it, then Remus Lupin. The colour drained from Andromeda's face. Sirius? My cousin Sirius. Do you know him? I knew him, Andromeda said carefully. He was James's best friend. They were practically brothers from their first day at Hogwarts. And Remus Lupin was part of their group as well. A gentle, scholarly boy who would have loved you dearly. Harry felt something twist in his stomach. Where are they now? Why didn't they take me? Andromeda was quiet for a long moment, and Harry could see her weighing how much truth a 10-year-old could handle. It's complicated, Harry. There were circumstances after your parents' deaths that made it impossible for either of them to care for you immediately. But the fact remains that your parents trusted them with your welfare, and someone chose to ignore those wishes entirely. The implications settled around Harry like cold water. Not only had he been placed with people who didn't want him, but there were people who might have wanted him. People his parents had specifically chosen, who had never even been told he needed caring for. Could I meet them? Harry asked. Mr. Black and Mr. Lupin? I don't know, Andromeda admitted, but I can try to find out. In the meantime, I want you to know that you have family who care about your well-being. My husband Ted and I, our daughter Nymphadora, we would be honored to include you in our family, if you'd like that. Harry stared at her, trying to process the offer. A family, people who wanted to include him rather than tolerate him. You mean like visiting for holidays and things? If that's what you want, Andromeda said gently. Or more, if the legal situation allows it. The point is, Harry, you're not alone anymore. You have people who care about you simply because you exist, not because of what you can do for them or how little trouble you cause. The warmth in Harry's chest expanded until it felt like it might crack his ribs. He had never imagined that caring could be offered so freely, without conditions or expectations attached. I'd like that, he said, his voice coming out smaller than he'd intended. I'd like that very much. Andromeda smiled, and for the first time in his life, Harry saw his own eyes reflected in someone else's face. Then we'll make it happen. I promise. After Andromeda left, Harry spent the evening in his guest quarters, trying to compose his first letter to someone who actually cared about his welfare. The parchment in front of him remained stubbornly blank as he struggled to find words for feelings he'd never expected to have. Finally, he picked up his quill and began to write. Dear Mrs. Tonks, thank you for visiting me today and for explaining about our family. I've never had family before who wanted to know me, so I'm not sure how this works, but I would like to learn. Griphook says that writing letters is important because it helps people understand each other better, even when they're far apart. He also says that politeness is the foundation of all meaningful relationships. But I think you already know that, because you were very kind to me, even though you didn't have to be. I'm learning a lot about magic and about my parents, and about how things are supposed to work when adults actually care about children's welfare. It's very different from what I thought life was like, but I think I prefer this version. Would it be all right if I wrote to you again? I promise to be a good correspondent and not to bother you too much. Your cousin, Harry Potter, P.S. Griphook, says I should tell you that my magical education is progressing well, and that my core is healing properly now that the suppression charms have been removed. I'm not sure what that means exactly, but he seemed to think you would want to know. Harry sealed the letter with the personal wax seal that Griphook had helped him design, a simple pattern that incorporated both the Potter family crest and his own initials. It was the first time in his life that he'd had a way to mark something as definitively his own. Meanwhile, at Hogwarts, Deputy Headmistress McGonagall was discovering that formal challenges to the authority of Albus Dumbledore required more paperwork than she had anticipated. The forms spread across her desk represented every legal avenue available for questioning the guardianship decisions of the Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot. Petitions for review, requests for investigation, formal complaints about conflicts of interest, all of it written in the precise legal language that transformed personal outrage into institutional action. McGonagall had spent 30 years working within the system, trusting that proper channels existed for addressing improprieties when they occurred. She was about to discover whether that trust had been justified. The letter to the Department of Child Welfare was perhaps the most damning. To the Director of Magical Child Welfare, I write to formally request an immediate investigation into the guardianship arrangements made for Harry James Potter following the deaths of his parents in October 1981. Recent evidence has come to light suggesting that the placement of Mr. Potter with his maternal relatives may have been conducted without proper legal authority and in direct contradiction to the wishes expressed in his parents' will. Furthermore, there is reason to believe that the investigating procedures typically required for such placements may have been circumvented through the undue influence of the presiding authority. As Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, I have professional obligations regarding the welfare of all magical children who will eventually come under our educational care. I cannot, in good conscience, allow Mr. Potter to enter this school without assurance that his previous care has met the standards we expect for all our students. I request your immediate attention to this matter. Professor M. McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. McGonagall sealed the letter with her official school seal and added it to the growing pile of correspondence that would soon make Dumbledore's careful arrangements a matter of very public interest. Outside her window, the Scottish Highlands stretched away toward horizons that had witnessed centuries of political upheaval and social change. McGonagall had always believed that institutions survived because they remained flexible enough to correct their course when necessary. She was about to test whether the wizarding world's institutions possessed that kind of flexibility, or whether they would circle the wagons around comfortable lies rather than confront uncomfortable truths. Either way, Harry Potter was no longer going to suffer in silence for the sake of political convenience. The boy had endured quite enough sacrifice for one lifetime. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of magical pressure against the ancient wards of Gringotts Bank, a subtle probing that felt like someone testing the locks on a door they had no business opening. Harry felt it as a buzzing in his teeth, an uncomfortable resonance that made the air in his study chamber feel thick and oppressive. Across the table, Griphook's head snapped up from the inheritance documents they'd been reviewing, his dark eyes suddenly alert with the particular wariness of someone who had spent centuries defending goblin sovereignty against wizard encroachment. "Master Harry," Griphook said quietly, "I need you to remain very calm and listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Someone is attempting to breach our security, using considerable magical force." Harry set down his quill, noting absently that his hand wasn't shaking, despite the fear that was crawling up his spine like cold fingers. A week of proper food and genuine safety had done wonders for his ability to think clearly under pressure. Is it him? Dumbledore? Almost certainly. And he has not come alone. Griphook moved to the chamber's communication crystal, speaking rapidly in gobbledygook to whatever goblin was monitoring the bank's defenses. The response that came back made his expression grow grim. 6 wizards at the main entrance, demanding immediate access to our facilities, and the surrender of one Harry James Potter to the custody of the Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot. "Can they get in?" Harry asked. Griphook's smile was all sharp teeth and ancient confidence. "Master Harry, Gringotts has stood for over 1,000 years. We have survived goblin rebellions, wizard wars, and the occasional dragon escape. One elderly headmaster, with delusions of authority, is hardly our greatest challenge." As if summoned by his words, Director Ragnok appeared in the chamber doorway, his ancient face set in lines of absolute determination. "Master Potter," he said, with formal courtesy, "Albus Dumbledore is requesting an audience with you under the authority of magical guardianship laws. We have informed him that you are under goblin protection and that all communications must go through proper legal channels. He has declined to accept this explanation." "What does that mean?" Harry asked. "It means," Ragnok replied with the satisfaction of someone who had been anticipating this moment for days, "that Albus Dumbledore is about to discover the difference between political authority and actual power." The confrontation at the main entrance of Gringotts was, by goblin standards, a masterpiece of controlled intimidation. Dumbledore stood at the threshold with 5 other wizards Harry didn't recognize, all of them wearing expressions of righteous authority that suggested they were accustomed to having their demands met without question. "I am here," Dumbledore announced to the dozen goblins who had assembled to block his path, "in my capacity as Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, to collect Harry Potter from what I can only assume is an unfortunate misunderstanding." Gornuk, the chief legal advisor, stepped forward with a scroll that seemed to radiate official displeasure. "Chief Warlock Dumbledore," he said, with the particular politeness that preceded declarations of war, "you are attempting to enter goblin sovereign territory to remove a client who is under our formal protection. Under the Treaty of 1682, this constitutes an act of aggression against the goblin nation." "The boy is under illegal guardianship," one of Dumbledore's companions said, a wizard whose expensive robes and dismissive tone marked him as someone accustomed to getting his way through the application of political pressure. "The Wizengamot has authority over all matters concerning magical children." "Indeed." Gornuk's smile could have cut glass. "Then perhaps you would care to explain why the Wizengamot's authority was not exercised when multiple reports of child abuse were filed and subsequently buried. Why no investigation was conducted into the welfare of Britain's most famous magical child. Why the proper procedures for magical guardianship were circumvented in favor of fraudulent documentation." The silence that followed was loud enough to echo off the marble walls of Gringotts' entrance hall. "Furthermore," Gornuk continued, clearly enjoying himself, "if you wish to challenge goblin protection of our client, you may do so through the proper legal channels. I believe the Wizengamot chambers are available for emergency sessions. Shall we convene one now?" Dumbledore's blue eyes, usually twinkling with benevolent authority, had gone cold as winter ice. "That will not be necessary. I'm sure we can resolve this matter through private discussion." "I'm sure we can," Gornuk agreed pleasantly. "In the Wizengamot chambers, under full legal procedure, with all evidence presented for public review." 2 hours later, the Wizengamot chambers filled with more witches and wizards than had attended a session in years. Word had spread with the peculiar speed that gossip achieved in the closely connected wizarding world. Albus Dumbledore was being challenged publicly over his guardianship decisions regarding Harry Potter. Harry sat in the gallery reserved for interested parties, flanked by Griphook and Director Ragnok, trying not to let the attention of 50 adult wizards make him feel smaller than he already was. He had never seen so many people in one place, had never been the center of such focused scrutiny, and the weight of it pressed against him like a physical thing. "Remember," Griphook murmured quietly, "you are not on trial here. You are the injured party seeking justice. These people are here to determine whether the laws they claim to uphold have any actual meaning." Amelia Bones rose from her seat in the prosecutor's section, her arms full of files that Harry recognized as the evidence they had been building for days. When she spoke, her voice carried across the chamber with the authority of someone who had spent years presenting uncomfortable truths to people who preferred comfortable lies. "Members of the Wizengamot," she began, "we are here today because a child suffering has finally come to light after being systematically concealed for nearly a decade. Harry James Potter was placed with his maternal relatives following his parents' deaths, not through proper legal procedure, but through fraudulent documentation that claimed a life debt that never existed. She opened the first file, and magical projections appeared in the air above the chamber, documents that glowed with the telltale red light of forgery, child welfare reports that had been buried, tracking charms that had been placed without consent. These documents, Amelia continued, bear the magical signature of the presiding authority who authorized Mr. Potter's placement. That authority is Albus Dumbledore, currently serving as chief warlock of this very body. The murmur that ran through the chamber was like the sound of a nest of disturbed hornets. Harry could see witches and wizards turning to stare at Dumbledore, their expressions ranging from disbelief to growing anger. Dumbledore rose slowly, his usually commanding presence somehow diminished by the weight of evidence surrounding him. "Madam Bones," he said, "I think you will find that my actions were taken in the best interests of Mr. Potter's safety and the greater good of our community." "The greater good," Amelia repeated, and her tone could have frozen fire. "Perhaps you could explain to this body how systematic child abuse serves the greater good." She gestured, and new images appeared in the air. Photographs of the cupboard under the stairs, the bars on Harry's window, medical assessments that showed years of malnutrition and neglect. Mr. Potter was kept in a cupboard, starved, locked in rooms for days at a time, subjected to magical suppression that stunted his natural development. All while this body was told he was thriving in the care of loving relatives. Harry felt something hot and uncomfortable building in his chest as the images of his life were displayed for dozens of strangers to see. The attention, the pity, the anger on his behalf. It was overwhelming in a way that made his magic respond without his conscious direction. The lights in the chamber flickered. Several witches and wizards glanced up nervously as the magical atmosphere grew thick with barely controlled power. "Master Harry," Griphook said quietly, "breathe. Remember what Ironhand taught you about working with your magic rather than against it." But Harry was beyond breathing exercises. 9 years of suppressed anger, of swallowed pride, of accepting treatment he now understood he had never deserved. All of it was rising in him like a tide that had finally found its outlet. "I lived in a cupboard," Harry said, and his voice carried across the suddenly silent chamber with unnatural clarity. "For 9 years, I lived in a cupboard and thought that was normal. I thought I deserved it, because everyone told me I was a freak and a burden, and lucky to have any home at all." The magical pressure in the room intensified. Several of the older Wizengamot members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "But I wasn't lucky," Harry continued, standing up despite Griphook's restraining hand. "I was stolen. Someone decided that my parents' wishes didn't matter, that the people they chose to care for me didn't matter, that I didn't matter as long as I served some purpose I was never told about." A window cracked, then another. "And now you want me to go back? You want me to return to people who never wanted me because the man who put me there says it's for the greater good?" Harry's magic blazed outward, wild and untrained, but carrying the full weight of a decade's worth of suppressed emotion. Every piece of glass in the chamber spider-webbed simultaneously. The magical lights dimmed and flared in response to his fury. "I won't go back," Harry said, and his voice was no longer that of a 10-year-old child, but something deeper, older, filled with power that had finally found its voice. "I won't go back to being grateful for scraps and apologies for breathing. I have family now. I have people who want me to exist. And if you try to take that away from me—" He didn't finish the threat. He didn't need to. The magical signature radiating from him was clear enough on its own. In the silence that followed, Severus Snape rose from his seat in the gallery, His face was pale, his dark eyes fixed on Harry with an expression that might have been recognition. "I would like to give testimony," he said. Amelia Bones nodded. "The chamber recognizes Severus Snape." Snape moved to the witness stand with the rigid posture of someone walking to his own execution. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the shocked silence. "For 10 years, he said, "I have believed that Harry Potter was living in luxury with relatives who spoiled and indulged him. I was told this by Albus Dumbledore, who assured me that the boy's placement was not only appropriate, but necessary to prevent him from developing an inflated sense of his own importance." He paused, visibly struggling with what came next. "I have spent 10 years hating a child for suffering I thought he wasn't enduring. I have spent 10 years believing that James Potter's sacrifice was being honored by a placement that ensured his son grew up loved and protected. I was wrong about everything." Snape turned to look directly at Harry, his black eyes bright with something that might have been tears. "The life debt that supposedly justified your placement with your relatives never existed. Your father never saved your aunt's life. The magical documentation claiming otherwise is a forgery, created specifically to provide false legal justification for a decision that served no one's interests but those of the man who made it." He turned back to face the chamber, his voice growing stronger. "Albus Dumbledore told me that Harry Potter needed to grow up humble and grateful. What he actually did was ensure that Harry Potter grew up abused and abandoned. The difference between those two things is the difference between wisdom and cruelty." The chamber erupted in voices, shocked gasps, angry demands for explanation, calls for order that went unheeded. Through it all, Harry stood in the gallery, his magic still crackling around him like visible lightning, and felt something fundamental shift in the foundations of the world he was learning to navigate. Dumbledore sat in his chief warlock's chair, looking every one of his 110 years, and said nothing at all. For the first time in his long life, Albus Dumbledore had nothing to say that could possibly make things better, and in the gallery, surrounded by allies who had chosen to stand with him rather than against him, Harry Potter discovered what it felt like to have his anger taken seriously by adults who had the power to do something about it. The sensation was better than magic. Chapter 8. The Trial. The full formal session of the Wizengamot that convened the following morning bore little resemblance to the emergency proceeding of the previous day. Gone was the shocked murmuring and confused questions. In their place sat the weight of institutional gravity that accompanied trials where the evidence had been reviewed, the charges formally filed, and the international community had taken notice. Harry sat in the witness section, flanked by Griphook and Director Ragnok, watching as witches and wizards he didn't recognize filed into the observer galleries. Amelia Bones had explained that word of the proceedings had reached the International Confederation of Wizards overnight, bringing delegates who wanted to witness how Britain handled accusations of systematic child abuse by one of its most prominent leaders. "Remember," Griphook said quietly, "today is not about proving your worth or earning anyone's belief. Today is about ensuring that those who failed you face the consequences of their actions." The Chief Justice of the Wizengamot, a stern witch whose nameplate read Augusta Longbottom, called the session to order with the particular authority of someone who had presided over decades of magical jurisprudence. Harry noticed that Dumbledore was no longer sitting in the Chief Warlock's chair, having been required to step down due to conflict of interest. "This tribunal," Chief Justice Longbottom announced, "convenes to examine charges of child endangerment, magical fraud, and treaty violations brought against Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore in the matter of the guardianship of Harry James Potter." Amelia Bones rose from the prosecution table, her arms filled with evidence that represented nearly a week of intensive investigation. "Chief Justice, members of the Wizengamot, honored international observers, we are here because a child's suffering was not only ignored, but actively concealed by the very institutions meant to protect him. She gestured to a magical projection that appeared above the chamber, showing a timeline that began with James and Lily Potter's deaths and continued through 9 years of buried reports and falsified documents. "The evidence will show," Amelia continued, "that Albus Dumbledore systematically violated magical guardianship law, forged legal documentation, and conspired to conceal child abuse through the manipulation of official reports and the coercion of unwilling guardians." The first witness called was Professor McGonagall, who approached the witness stand with the rigid posture of someone who had spent sleepless nights reviewing 30 years of misplaced trust. "Professor McGonagall," Amelia began, "how long have you served as Deputy Headmistress under Albus Dumbledore?" 31 years, McGonagall replied, her voice steady, despite the obvious strain. "And in that time, did you ever question Mr. Dumbledore's decisions regarding Harry Potter's welfare?" McGonagall was quiet for a long moment. "I should have," she said finally. "On November 1st, 1981, I watched Albus Dumbledore leave an infant on a doorstep in the middle of the night. I expressed concerns about the suitability of the Dursley family as guardians. I was told that my concerns were noted, but that the placement was necessary for reasons I would not understand." "What reasons were you given for this placement?" "Blood protection," McGonagall said, her voice growing harder. "I was told that Harry's mother's sacrifice had created powerful protective magic that could only be maintained by placing him with her blood relatives. I was assured that the Dursleys would love him as their own son." Amelia consulted her notes. "And over the years, did you receive updates on Harry's welfare?" "I requested them regularly. I was consistently told that Harry was thriving, happy, healthy, well-loved and well cared for. I was told that he was growing up normal and unaffected by his fame, exactly as his parents would have wanted. Did you ever see evidence of this thriving condition?" McGonagall's composure cracked slightly. "No. I accepted Albus Dumbledore's word because I trusted him. I trusted his judgment, his wisdom, his compassion. I believed that someone who had dedicated his life to protecting children would never allow harm to come to one under his care." She turned to look directly at Harry, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I failed you, Mr. Potter. I should have demanded proof. I should have insisted on personal verification. I should have remembered that trust without verification is not wisdom. It's abdication of responsibility." The questioning continued with precision that left no room for misinterpretation. McGonagall testified about the educational liaison requests from Gringotts that had first alerted her to irregularities, about her discovery that she knew nothing concrete about Harry's life beyond Dumbledore's assurances, about the growing realization that 30 years of trust had been systematically exploited. Next came Vernon Dursley, who entered the witness stand with the particular reluctance of someone who had been granted immunity in exchange for truthful testimony. His face was red and sweaty, his hands shaking as he faced a room full of magical people whose very existence challenged everything he thought he understood about the natural order. "Mr. Dursley," Amelia said, "you have been granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for your complete and honest testimony about Harry Potter's treatment in your home. Do you understand the conditions of this agreement?" "Yes," Vernon said, his voice barely audible. "How long did Harry Potter live in your home?" 9 years, from when he was a baby until last week. "And during that time, where did he sleep?" Vernon's face went an even deeper shade of red. "In the cupboard under the stairs." The murmur that ran through the chamber was like the sound of distant thunder. Several international observers leaned forward, their expressions ranging from disbelief to outrage. For how long did he sleep in this cupboard? Until he was 11. Was supposed to be until he was 11. We only moved him to Dudley's second bedroom when we started getting those letters. "What letters?" Vernon looked toward Dumbledore with something that might have been accusation. "Letters telling us we were being watched, that our treatment of the boy was being monitored, that if we didn't follow instructions exactly, there would be consequences. Amelia produced a collection of parchments that glowed with the particular light of preserved magical communications. "Are these the letters you received?" Vernon nodded miserably. "Every time we tried to treat him like a normal child, send him to state school, let him have friends, stop the punishments when he did freakish things, a letter would come. Instructions about keeping him humble, keeping him grateful, making sure he never got ideas above his station." "And these instructions came from whom?" "From him," Vernon said, pointing a shaking finger at Dumbledore. "From the man who told us we didn't have a choice about taking him in the first place." The testimony continued with methodical brutality. Vernon described years of deliberately inadequate food, clothing that didn't fit, punishments that lasted for days, the systematic emotional abuse that had been justified as necessary discipline. With each admission, the atmosphere in the chamber grew heavier, more charged with barely controlled outrage. When Petunia took the witness stand, her testimony was delivered in a voice so quiet that the court had to use magical amplification to ensure everyone could hear. "Mrs. Dursley," Amelia said gently, "you have also been granted immunity in exchange for truthful testimony. Can you tell this court about the circumstances under which you agreed to take custody of Harry Potter?" Petunia's hands twisted in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. "I didn't agree," she whispered. "I was told I didn't have a choice." "By whom?" "By Professor Dumbledore. He came to see me the day after Lily died. He said that Lily had saved my life when we were children, and that I owed her a life debt. He said the magic wouldn't work unless I truly accepted responsibility for Harry, and that if I refused, Harry would die and it would be my fault." "Had your sister actually saved your life?" Petunia shook her head. "I don't know what he was talking about. Lily and we weren't close after she went to magic school. We barely spoke in the years before she died. I can't think of any time she saved my life." Amelia consulted the magical documents that had started this entire investigation. "Mrs. Dursley, magical analysis of the life debt documentation shows that it was created retroactively, forged after your sister's death to provide justification for a placement that had already been decided upon. You never owed your sister a life debt. The magical compulsion that forced you to take Harry was based on fraudulent documentation." The silence that followed was absolute. Petunia stared at Amelia with an expression of growing horror and understanding. "You mean I didn't have to?" she began. "You were coerced into accepting guardianship through magical fraud and emotional manipulation," Amelia confirmed. "You are as much a victim of this conspiracy as your nephew." When Harry was finally called to testify, he approached the witness stand with steady steps that surprised even him. A week of proper food and genuine safety had done more than heal his body. It had given him something he'd never had before, the confidence that came from knowing adults would listen to him and believe what he said. "Mr. Potter," Amelia said, "before we begin, I want you to know that this court believes you. You are not on trial. You are not being asked to prove that your suffering was real or significant. You are here so that this court can understand the full extent of what was done to you." Harry nodded, settling into the witness chair with the particular composure he had developed during his sessions with the goblin tutors. "I understand. Can you tell this court about your living conditions at the Dursley home?" Harry spoke quietly but clearly, describing 9 years of systematic neglect and abuse with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had finally learned that his experiences were not normal. He talked about the cupboard, the hunger, the isolation, the punishments for accidental magic that he hadn't understood or been able to control. "Did anyone ever tell you about your parents' true circumstances or the way they died?" "They told me my parents were drunk and irresponsible, and that they died in a car crash because they were driving while intoxicated. They said my parents left me with nothing but trouble for my relatives. How did you discover this was untrue? Griphook told me. He showed me the inheritance documents and explained about my family's history and what really happened to my parents. Amelia turned to address the chamber as a whole. The court should note that magical verification spells confirm that every statement Mr. Potter has made today is completely accurate according to his understanding and experience. Finally, it was Dumbledore's turn to speak in his own defense. He rose slowly, looking every one of his 110 years, and approached the witness stand with the careful dignity of someone whose entire worldview was crumbling around him. "Professor Dumbledore," the Chief Justice said, "you stand accused of systematic child endangerment, magical fraud, and conspiracy to conceal evidence of abuse. How do you answer these charges?" Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes surveying the chamber full of people who had once regarded him with unquestioning respect, and now watched him with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disgust. "I did what I believed was necessary," he said finally. "Harry Potter was the most famous child in our world. He had defeated Voldemort as an infant, and I knew that fame would be dangerous for him. He needed to grow up humble, grateful, and unaware of his celebrity until he was old enough to handle the responsibility that came with it." "And you believed," Amelia said, "that systematic abuse was an appropriate method for achieving this humility?" "I believed that Harry needed to understand that he was not special, that he was not entitled to special treatment simply because of what happened to him as a baby. The blood protection required—" "The blood protection," Amelia interrupted, "that you created through magical coercion rather than genuine love. The protection that could have been achieved through multiple other methods that would not have required child abuse." Dumbledore's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand. The prophecy, the greater good, there are factors at work here that are larger than any individual's comfort or happiness." "What prophecy?" the Chief Justice demanded. But Dumbledore had said too much. His face went pale as he realized he had revealed the existence of information that the court knew nothing about, information that suggested his manipulation of Harry's life went even deeper than the evidence had shown. "There is a prophecy concerning Harry Potter," he admitted reluctantly. "It suggests that he will play a crucial role in ensuring Voldemort's permanent defeat. Everything I have done has been to prepare him for that role." The chamber erupted in voices, shocked gasps, angry demands for explanation, calls for order that went unheeded. "You manipulated a child's entire life," Chief Justice Longbottom said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Based on a prophecy? You condemned him to years of abuse and isolation to serve your interpretation of a magical prediction? For the greater good." "There is no greater good," the Chief Justice said firmly, "that justifies the systematic abuse of a child. This court finds the defendant guilty on all charges." As the final judgment was read, Harry sat in the gallery surrounded by people who had chosen to fight for his welfare, and felt something fundamental settle into place inside him. For the first time in his life, adults had listened to his voice, believed his truth, and chosen to act on his behalf. Justice, Harry thought, felt remarkably like coming home. Chapter 9. Rebuilding the house on Grimmauld Place had never been meant for happiness, but Andromeda Tonks had spent 17 years proving that love could flourish in the most unlikely places. Harry stood in the doorway of what Andromeda had told him would be his room. Not a guest room, not a temporary space, but his room for as long as he wanted it, and tried to absorb the reality of walls that belonged to him, furniture chosen with his comfort in mind, and a window that looked out onto a garden where he was welcome to play. "It's not much," Andromeda said from behind him, her voice carrying the particular uncertainty of someone who wanted desperately to get this right. "We can change anything you don't like. Paint, furniture, decorations, whatever would make you feel more at home." Harry turned to look at her, this woman who had appeared in his life, like an answer to prayers he hadn't known how to pray. "It's perfect," he said, and meant it. The room was larger than the entire cupboard under the stairs, furnished with actual care rather than grudging necessity, and most importantly, the door had no lock on the outside. "The trial concluded yesterday," Andromeda continued, settling onto the window seat with the easy grace of someone comfortable in her own space. "Dumbledore has been stripped of all his official positions and sentenced to house arrest pending further investigation. The Wizengamot has granted me temporary guardianship while the Department of Child Welfare conducts a full review of your case." Harry nodded, though the legal implications still felt distant and unreal compared to the immediate reality of safety. "What does that mean for me?" "It means," said a new voice from the doorway, "that you're stuck with us until you're old enough to make your own decisions about where you want to live." Harry turned to see a young woman with violently pink hair and a grin that seemed to take up half her face. She was perhaps 17, tall and gangly, in the way of someone who had recently outgrown their childhood proportions, and her eyes held the particular mischief of someone who had never met a rule she couldn't find a way around. "Harry," Andromeda said, with the fond exasperation of long practice, "meet your cousin, Nymphadora." "Nymphadora? Meet Harry." "Just Tonks," the young woman said firmly, her hair shifting from pink to bright blue as Harry watched in fascination. "And you're the famous Harry Potter who just brought down Dumbledore. Wicked." Harry blinked, unsure how to respond to being called wicked in what seemed to be a complimentary way. Thank you?" Tonks laughed, a sound like silver bells with a tendency toward mischief. "You're going to fit right in here, cousin. We specialize in making trouble for people who deserve it." The first week at the Tonks household was unlike anything Harry had ever experienced. Meals happened at regular times and included enough food for everyone. Conversations occurred without shouting or accusations. Adults asked his opinion about things and seemed genuinely interested in his answers. Most remarkably, no one seemed to expect him to be grateful for basic necessities like food, shelter, and clothing that fit properly. "It's not charity," Ted Tonks explained on Harry's third day, when Harry had attempted to thank him for the 5th time for a simple breakfast. "It's what families do for each other. You don't owe us anything for caring about your well-being." Ted was a quiet man, with gentle hands, and the particular patience of someone who had spent years proving that love was more important than blood purity to the people who mattered. He worked as a solicitor in the Muggle world, helping people navigate legal systems that often seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify, and he had brought that same methodical kindness to the project of helping Harry understand that he deserved to take up space in the world. "But you barely know me," Harry said, still struggling with the concept that care could be offered without conditions attached. "I knew your parents," Ted replied simply. "James and Lily were good people who wanted their son to grow up surrounded by love. The fact that their wishes were ignored doesn't change what they wanted for you." The therapy sessions began during his second week with the Tonks family. Healer Rebecca Thorne was a middle-aged witch whose office felt more like a comfortable sitting room than a medical facility, and whose manner suggested that she had seen enough varieties of human suffering to find very little shocking. "Trauma," she explained during their first session, "is what happens when our natural coping mechanisms are overwhelmed by experiences too big or too frightening for our minds to process normally. It's not a sign of weakness or failure. It's a normal response to abnormal circumstances." Harry sat in the comfortable chair she had indicated, trying to decide whether he trusted this gentle-voiced woman with the truth of his experiences. What if the circumstances weren't that abnormal? What if they were just life? "Harry," Healer Thorne said softly, "living in a cupboard is not normal. Being starved is not normal. Being told you're worthless is not normal. The adults who convinced you that it was normal were lying to you. The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were kind. For 9 years, Harry had been told that his treatment was what he deserved, what he had earned through his mere existence. Hearing an adult say definitively that this was untrue felt like having a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying suddenly lifted from his chest. "The goal of our work together," Healer Thorn continued, "is not to forget what happened to you. The goal is to help you understand that what happened to you is not who you are." Nymphadora, Tonks, became the sister Harry had never imagined having. She was loud where he was quiet, bold where he was cautious, and utterly fearless in her determination to introduce him to all the fun he had missed during his years of enforced isolation. "Right," she said one afternoon, settling cross-legged on his bedroom floor with a collection of objects Harry didn't recognize. "Magical education, Tonks style. Forget whatever boring nonsense they'll try to teach you at Hogwarts. This is the stuff that actually matters." She pulled out what looked like a rubber ball that seemed to shift colors when Harry wasn't looking directly at it. "Remember all. Glows red when you've forgotten something important. Completely useless for studying because everything feels important when you're panicking about exams, but brilliant for making sure you've packed everything before a trip." Next came a small mirror that seemed to hold its own light. "Two-way mirror. Pair them up, and you can talk to whoever has the matching one. Dead useful for staying in touch with people you actually want to hear from, as opposed to owls that broadcast your business to anyone with decent eyesight." Harry watched in fascination as Tonks demonstrated each object with the casual expertise of someone who had grown up surrounded by magic. "How do you know all this?" "Dad's a Muggle-born," Tonks said with a grin. "Mum grew up in a family that considered knowing about useful magic to be beneath their dignity. Between the two of them, they figured out that the really important magic is the stuff that makes daily life better, not the stuff that makes you look impressive at dinner parties." The educational tutoring that Andromeda arranged was unlike anything Harry had experienced during his years at Little Whinging Primary. Instead of being expected to fail quietly, he found himself working with tutors who seemed genuinely invested in helping him succeed. "Mathematics," explained Professor Clearwater, a retired Hogwarts instructor who specialized in helping students catch up on missed education, "is simply a language for describing patterns in the world around us. Once you understand that numbers are tools rather than obstacles, everything else becomes much simpler." Harry discovered that he was actually quite good at learning when no one was shouting at him for asking questions or punishing him for showing interest in subjects beyond his expected capabilities. History became fascinating when presented as stories about real people making difficult decisions rather than lists of dates to memorize. Literature opened up possibilities he had never imagined when he was allowed to read books without worrying about whether someone would take them away as punishment for unrelated infractions. "You have a good mind," Professor Clearwater told him, after a particularly successful lesson on basic magical theory. "It's been neglected, not damaged. With proper encouragement, you should have no trouble keeping up with your age group by the time you start formal magical education." 3 weeks into his stay with the Tonks family, Andromeda approached him with the careful tone she used when discussing subjects that might be emotionally difficult. "Harry," she said, "I was wondering if you might like to visit your parents' graves. I know it's been complicated, learning the truth about how they died, and I thought you might want to see where they're buried." Harry considered this. He had spent 9 years believing his parents were drunk fools who had died through their own irresponsibility. Learning that they had been murdered while protecting him had reframed everything he thought he understood about love, sacrifice, and family obligations. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "But would it be all right if you came with me? I don't think I want to go alone." Andromeda's smile was warm with something that might have been relief. "I'd be honored to accompany you." Godric's Hollow was a small village that seemed caught between the magical and mundane worlds, its narrow streets lined with houses that looked perfectly ordinary, until you noticed the garden gnomes that moved when they thought no one was looking, or the chimneys that puffed smoke in colors that defied meteorological explanation. The graveyard sat on a hill overlooking the village, its ancient stones weathered by centuries of English rain and wind. Harry found his parents' grave easily. The headstone was newer than most, its carved words still sharp and clear against the dark granite. James Potter, born 27th March 1960, died 31st October 1981. Lily Potter, born 30th January 1960, died 31st October 1981. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. Harry stared at the inscription, trying to reconcile the dates with his understanding of his own history. They were so young. 21, Andromeda confirmed softly. Barely older than Nymphadora is now. And they died protecting me. They died because they loved you more than they loved their own lives. There's a difference. Harry knelt beside the grave and placed the flowers they had brought, lilies, because Andromeda had said they were his mother's favorites. The gesture felt both significant and inadequate, a small offering that could never encompass the magnitude of what he owed to these two people whose faces he couldn't remember, but whose sacrifice had shaped every day of his life. "I'm going to be better," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the graves or to himself. "I'm going to be someone worth dying for." Behind him, Andromeda placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Harry," she said, "you already are." That evening, back at the house on Grimmauld Place, Andromeda brought out the Black Family Grimoire, an ancient book bound in leather so old it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "These are family spells," she explained, settling beside Harry at the kitchen table with the book between them. "Magic that's been passed down through generations, each family member adding their own discoveries and improvements." Harry traced the ornate script with one finger, marveling at the idea that he had a family magical tradition stretching back centuries. What kind of spells? Practical ones mostly. Household charms, protective wards, communication magic. The flashy battle magic got most of the Black family killed or imprisoned, so we focus on the spells that actually improve daily life. She turned to a page covered with diagrams that seemed to move when Harry looked at them sideways. This one, for instance, is for creating unbreakable communication links between family members. No matter how far apart you are, you can always reach each other if someone needs help. Can you teach me? Andromeda's smile was bright with genuine pleasure. I was hoping you'd ask. Family magic works best when it's shared freely, not hoarded jealously. The more people who know these spells, the stronger the magic becomes. As August drew to a close and the reality of his upcoming Hogwarts education began to feel more real than theoretical, Harry found himself in the unfamiliar position of looking forward to the future rather than simply enduring the present. He had family now, real family who wanted him to succeed and were willing to help him get there. He had friends who treated him as an equal rather than a burden. He had adults who listened to his opinions and trusted his judgment about his own well-being. Most importantly, he had learned that the voice inside his head that had spent years telling him he was worthless, unwanted, and fundamentally flawed had been lying all along. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter believed he might actually deserve to be happy. The feeling was better than magic. Chapter 10. New Bonds. The Department of Magical Child Welfare occupied a series of bright, cheerful offices that seemed designed to contradict every stereotype about government bureaucracy. The walls were painted in warm yellows and soft blues, the chairs were actually comfortable, and the witch behind the reception desk smiled at Harry as though his presence was a welcome surprise rather than an administrative burden. "Mr. Potter," she said, consulting a file that was thicker than Harry expected. "Director Walsh will see you and the Tonks family now." Harry walked between Andromeda and Ted, through corridors lined with photographs of children who had found new families, their faces bright with the particular happiness that came from being genuinely wanted. Some of the children looked like Harry imagined he must have looked at the Dursleys, thin, wary, uncertain. Others appeared in later photos, the same children, but fuller, more confident, surrounded by adults whose body language spoke of protection and pride. "Nervous?" Andromeda asked quietly. Harry considered this. A month ago, the idea of sitting in an office while adults discussed his future would have terrified him. Now, surrounded by people who had proven their commitment to his well-being through consistent action rather than empty promises, he found himself more curious than afraid. "A little," he admitted, "but good nervous, I think." Director Walsh was a middle-aged wizard whose office walls were covered with certificates in magical child psychology, family law, and what appeared to be advanced training in recognizing and treating magical trauma. When he smiled at Harry, it was with the particular warmth of someone who had spent years ensuring that children's voices were heard and believed. "Harry," he said, settling behind his desk with Harry's case file spread before him. "I've been following your situation since the Gringotts investigation began. First, I want to apologize on behalf of this department. We failed you badly, and there's no excuse for that failure." Harry shifted in his chair, still uncomfortable with adults apologizing to him for things that weren't his fault. "It's all right." "No," Director Walsh said firmly. "It's not all right. But we're here today to make sure it doesn't happen again, to you or to any other child in our care." He opened the file and consulted the first page. "Mrs. Tonks has petitioned for formal adoption, with Mr. Tonks as co-guardian. This would give you a permanent magical family with full inheritance rights, educational support, and most importantly, the legal protection that comes from having adults who are committed to your welfare rather than simply obligated to house you." Harry looked at Andromeda, who was watching him with an expression of carefully controlled hope. "You want to adopt me? Officially?" "We want you to be our son," Andromeda said simply. "Not our ward, not our responsibility, not our burden. Our son, if you'll have us as parents." The word son sent something warm and unfamiliar through Harry's chest. He had spent 10 years being told he was a burden, an obligation, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. The idea that someone might choose to claim him as family felt like stepping into sunshine after a lifetime of shadows. "I'd like that," he said, his voice coming out smaller than he intended. "I'd like that very much." The paperwork that followed was extensive, but strangely comforting. Forms that asked about his preferences, his concerns, his hopes for the future. Documents that required multiple signatures to ensure that every adult involved understood their commitment to his well-being. Magical contracts that would protect him from ever again being placed with people who saw him as anything less than a treasured family member. "There's one more thing," Director Walsh said, as they prepared to leave. "Your case has become quite well known in our community. We've received dozens of letters from other families, other children, people who were inspired by your courage to speak out about their own situations." He handed Harry a thick bundle of correspondence, tied with ribbon. "You don't have to read these if you don't want to. But I thought you should know that your bravery has already helped other children find their voices." That evening, Harry sat in his room in his house, with his family, and carefully read through the letters that had arrived in response to news of his case. "Dear Harry, wrote a girl who signed herself simply as Emma. I read in the Prophet about what happened to you, and wanted you to know that you're not alone. My uncle used to lock me in the cellar when I did accidental magic, and I thought that was normal too, until I read about your trial. I told my teacher at school, and now I'm living with my grandmother, who says magic is a gift, not a punishment. Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth. Master Potter wrote a formal hand that belonged to someone named Marcus. Your testimony before the Wizengamot gave me the courage to report my own situation. I had been told that squib children were lucky to receive any care at all, and that I should be grateful for whatever scraps my magical relatives provided. I am now living with a Muggle family who value me for who I am, rather than what magic I can or cannot perform. Your example showed me that I deserved better than gratitude for mere survival. Letter after letter told similar stories. Children who had thought their suffering was normal, adults who had recognized patterns of abuse they had previously ignored, families who had been inspired to reach out to struggling relatives rather than assume someone else was handling the problem. Harry? Andromeda's voice came from the doorway. How are you managing with those? Harry looked up from a particularly moving letter from a boy whose parents had told him his magical outbursts were signs of dark wizard tendencies that needed to be beaten out of him. I never thought... I just told the truth about what happened to me. I didn't know other people were going through the same things. Andromeda entered the room and settled on the window seat, her expression thoughtful. That's often how it works with abuse, unfortunately. The people doing the hurting convince their victims that the situation is normal or deserved, or just the way things are. When someone like you stands up and says, "This isn't normal, this isn't acceptable," it gives other people permission to question their own circumstances. So it helped, me talking about what the Dursleys did. It helped enormously. You've probably saved dozens of children from years of unnecessary suffering. Harry folded the letters carefully and placed them in the wooden box Ted had helped him choose for keeping important correspondence. The idea that his worst experiences might have served a purpose beyond simply surviving them felt strange and significant, like finding flowers growing in ground he had thought was barren. The next week brought his first real birthday party. Harry had technically had a birthday celebration at Gringotts, cake and presents and adults who were genuinely pleased about his continued existence. But this was different. This was a party planned by people who loved him, attended by other magical children who had been invited because Andromeda and Ted wanted Harry to have friends his own age, held in a house where his happiness was the primary goal, rather than an afterthought. Right then, Tonks announced, her hair a festive gold for the occasion. Time for proper birthday party games. None of that standing around making polite conversation nonsense. The children who had come, mostly the sons and daughters of families the Tonks knew from work, magical school, or neighborhood connections, looked at Tonks with the mixture of fascination and slight fear that she inspired in most people under the age of 20. "This is magical hide-and-seek," she continued, producing what looked like a perfectly ordinary handkerchief from her robes. "When I drop this, you have 30 seconds to hide anywhere in the house or garden. Use any magic you like. Disillusionment charms, shrinking spells, transfiguration, whatever you can manage. Last person found wins." Harry had never played hide-and-seek with magic before. Had never played hide-and-seek at all, really, since the Dursleys considered games a waste of time that could be better spent on chores. But watching the other children scatter with delighted laughter, calling out suggestions for good hiding spots and warnings about areas that were off-limits, he felt something unfamiliar and wonderful unfurling in his chest. This was what childhood was supposed to look like. He found himself hiding behind a garden shed that had been enlarged on the inside to serve as Ted's workshop, crammed into a space between a collection of broken clocks and a half-finished cabinet that seemed to be assembling itself without supervision. Through the tiny window, he could hear the other children moving through the garden, their voices bright with excitement, and the particular joy that came from playing games where everyone was expected to have fun, rather than where some people won at others' expense. "Found you," called Sarah Clearwater, Professor Clearwater's granddaughter, a girl about Harry's age with curly brown hair and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. She squeezed into the hiding spot beside him, and they sat together, listening to the continuing sounds of the game outside. "This is brilliant," she said quietly. "Your cousin Tonks is mad, but in the best possible way." Harry grinned, still getting used to the idea that he was allowed to enjoy things without worrying about consequences. "She's teaching me about all the fun I missed while I was living with my relatives." Were they really as awful as the Prophet said? Harry considered this. The Daily Prophet had covered his case with the particular attention that the magical press reserved for stories involving famous people behaving badly, but even their sensationalized reporting had barely scratched the surface of what his life at Privet Drive had actually been like. "Probably worse," he said honestly. "But I'm here now, and they can't hurt me anymore. That's what matters." Sarah nodded with the wisdom of someone who had grown up, understanding that some families were better than others, but that it was always possible to build new connections when the old ones failed. "Well, you've got proper family now. The Tonks are good people." When they were finally discovered, third to last, which Harry considered an excellent showing for his first magical hide-and-seek, they emerged from the workshop to find the party had evolved into something that looked like organized chaos, but felt like pure joy. The visit to Diagon Alley that weekend was Harry's first experience, shopping with someone who actively wanted him to have nice things. "Right," Andromeda said, as they stepped through the leaky cauldron into the magical shopping district. "We need to get you properly outfitted for life as a young wizard. Clothes that fit, books for pleasure reading, magical supplies for the practical jokes that Tonks is undoubtedly planning to teach you, and anything else that catches your fancy." Harry stared at the bustling street, remembering his previous visit when he had been overwhelmed, hungry, and seeking shelter from forces he didn't understand. Now, flanked by people who were committed to his happiness and carrying money that was indisputably his to spend, the same street looked like a treasure trove of possibilities. At Flourish and Blots, Andromeda helped him choose books about magical history written for children, adventure stories featuring young wizards, and a beautiful leather-bound journal for recording his thoughts as he learned about his heritage. "Reading for pleasure," she explained, "is different from studying for exams. The goal is to enjoy yourself and learn about things that interest you, not to memorize facts for tests." At Madame Malkin's, Harry experienced the surreal pleasure of being fitted for robes that were tailored specifically for his body, rather than handed down from larger relatives. "Growing room," Madame Malkin assured Andromeda, "but not so much that he looks like he's wearing a tent. Children should look like children, not like they're playing dress-up in adult clothing." At Magical Menagerie, they spent an hour watching the various creatures available for purchase as magical companions. Harry found himself particularly fascinated by a small owl that seemed to be trying to organize the other birds into neat rows, rearranging their perches with the determined efficiency of someone who had strong opinions about proper organization. "She's a neat little thing," the shopkeeper said, following Harry's gaze. "Very organized, very responsible. She'd be perfect for a young wizard who values reliability in his correspondence." Harry looked at Andromeda, who smiled with the particular warmth reserved for moments when children discovered they wanted something that their parents were happy to provide. "Would you like her?" Every wizard needs a reliable owl for correspondence. The owl, who Harry named Hedwig, after a name he found in one of his new history books, perched on his shoulder, with the satisfaction of someone who had finally found an acceptable living situation. Her presence felt like a promise that he would have people to write to, friends who would want to hear from him, a life that extended beyond the walls of any single house or household. As they walked back through Diagon Alley, laden with packages and accompanied by Hedwig's quiet commentary on the various people they passed, Harry realized that he was learning something fundamental about what it meant to be cared for by adults who saw his happiness as a goal rather than an inconvenience. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter understood what it felt like to be someone's treasured child. The feeling was better than any magic he had yet encountered. Chapter 11. The Wider World. The letter from the Wizengamot arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, delivered by an official owl whose formal bearing suggested that the correspondence it carried was of considerable institutional importance. Harry read it over breakfast, while Andromeda and Ted discussed the day's schedule, and Tonks attempted to convince her porridge to change colours through what appeared to be sheer force of will. "The Wizengamot," Harry read aloud, "cordially requests the honour of Mr. Harry Potter's presence at the ceremonial signing of the Magical Child Protection Act, scheduled for September 15th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon." "Blimey," Tonks said, her porridge now a cheerful shade of purple. "They're naming laws after you now. That's properly famous, that is." Andromeda took the letter from Harry's hands and read it more carefully. "This is the legislation that came out of your case. New requirements for magical child welfare investigations, mandatory reporting procedures for suspected abuse, and independent oversight of guardianship decisions. They want me there for the signing. They want to acknowledge that the law exists because you had the courage to speak the truth about what happened to you," Ted said gently. "Your testimony didn't just expose one case of abuse, it revealed systematic failures in how our society protects its most vulnerable members." Harry considered this while finishing his eggs. The idea that his worst experiences might have served a purpose beyond simply surviving them still felt strange and significant, like finding flowers growing in ground he had thought was barren. "Will I have to give another speech?" "Just a few words if you're comfortable doing so," Andromeda assured him. "You're not on trial anymore, Harry. You're being honored as someone whose bravery made the wizarding world a safer place for all magical children." The ceremony at the Wizengamot was unlike anything Harry had experienced in the formal chamber. Gone was the tense atmosphere of legal proceedings. In its place was something that felt like celebration, mixed with solemn acknowledgement of necessary change. Chief Justice Longbottom spoke about institutional responsibility and the importance of laws that protected children rather than simply managing them. Minister Jenkins discussed the moral obligation of magical society to ensure that power was never again used to silence those who needed protection most. When they called Harry forward to witness the signing, he approached the ornate desk with steady steps that surprised even him. 2 months of proper food and genuine safety had done more than heal his body. They had given him the confidence that came from knowing he belonged in spaces where important decisions were made. "Mr. Potter," Chief Justice Longbottom said, "your courage in speaking truth to power has fundamentally changed how magical Britain protects its children. Would you like to say a few words?" Harry looked out at the assembled witches and wizards, many of whom had been present for his original testimony, all of whom were here to witness the signing of laws that existed because he had refused to remain silent about his suffering. "I never wanted to be famous," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the chamber's acoustics. "I just wanted someone to listen when I said I was being hurt, and to believe me when I told them what was happening." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "These laws won't help me, I'm safe now, with family who want me to be happy and successful. But maybe they'll help other children who are still waiting for someone to listen to them, to believe them, to care enough to do something about their pain. The applause that followed was genuine and sustained, carrying the particular weight that accompanied recognition of moral courage rather than simple achievement. After the ceremony, Harry found himself in the unexpected position of receiving a formal request for a meeting from Severus Snape. "Professor Snape would like to speak with you," Andromeda said, reading from the carefully worded letter that had arrived that afternoon. "He says he owes you an apology that's long overdue." Harry remembered Snape's testimony during the trial, the pale, controlled professor admitting that he had spent 10 years hating a child for suffering he thought wasn't happening. The memory was complicated, mixing gratitude for Snape's honesty with uncertainty about what such a conversation might entail. "Do I have to meet with him?" "Not if you don't want to," Ted assured him. "But he did help expose the truth during your trial. It might be worth hearing what he has to say." They met in a neutral location, a quiet tea shop in Diagon Alley that specialized in serving customers who valued privacy and discretion. Snape was waiting when they arrived, his black robes making him look like a shadow against the cheerful yellow walls, his expression carrying the particular discomfort of someone who found apologies both necessary and deeply unnatural. "Potter," he said, rising as Harry approached the table. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Harry settled into the chair across from him, flanked by Andromeda and Ted in a show of support that felt both protective and empowering. "Professor Snape." Snape was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying Harry's face with the intensity of someone trying to reconcile long-held assumptions with uncomfortable reality. "For 10 years, he began slowly. I believed that you were living in luxury with relatives who spoiled and indulged you. I was told this by someone I trusted, someone whose word I had never had reason to question. Based on that information, I formed opinions about your character that were both unjust and deeply unfair." He paused, visibly struggling with what came next. "I hated you for what I thought you represented. Privilege unearned, comfort undeserved, the assumption that the world owed you special treatment because of your fame. I was wrong about everything." Harry watched Snape's face, seeing genuine remorse beneath the professor's carefully controlled expression. "You couldn't have known. Dumbledore lied to you too. I could have investigated. I could have asked questions. I could have demanded proof rather than accepting assurances." Snape's voice carried the particular weight of someone who had spent considerable time examining his own failures. "I was supposed to be protecting students, not prejudging them based on second-hand information and personal prejudices." "What will you do differently now?" Harry asked, surprising himself with the directness of the question. Snape's smile was barely visible but genuinely felt. "I will remember that assumptions are dangerous things, especially when they concern children who have no power to defend themselves against adult prejudices. I will ask questions when I should, and I will listen to answers even when they contradict what I want to believe." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from Snape's memories of Harry's parents to his regrets about the assumptions that had shaped his teaching philosophy. By the end, Harry found himself thinking that while he might never be comfortable with Professor Snape, he could respect someone who was willing to acknowledge their mistakes and commit to doing better. The work with Gringotts had evolved beyond simple banking services into something that felt like genuine cultural exchange. Harry spent 2 afternoons a week in the depths of the bank, learning about goblin customs, magical law, and the intricate financial systems that governed magical society. "Politics," Griphook explained during one of their sessions, "is simply the art of making decisions that affect large groups of people. The quality of those decisions depends entirely on whether the decision-makers understand the needs of everyone who will be affected by their choices." Harry was working his way through a complex document about international magical banking treaties, translating the formal language into concepts he could actually understand. So good politics requires good listening? Precisely. And the willingness to admit when you've been wrong and change course accordingly. Griphook gestured to the collection of correspondence that had been arriving steadily since Harry's case became public knowledge. Your testimony didn't just expose one case of abuse, Master Harry. It revealed systematic failures that had been ignored for years because the people making decisions weren't listening to the people being affected by them. The letters came from families across magical Britain, parents who had recognized patterns of abuse they had previously overlooked, children who had found the courage to speak up about their own situations, adults who had realized that survival wasn't the same thing as thriving. Many of the letters asked for advice, or simply for someone to listen to their stories. Harry found himself in the unexpected position of becoming a resource for other families, dealing with the aftermath of institutional failure and personal trauma. "What do I tell them?" he asked Andromeda, after reading a particularly difficult letter from a girl whose magical guardian had been using imperious curses to ensure her compliance with household rules. "You tell them the truth," Andromeda replied, "that they deserve better than they're getting, that they're not alone, and that there are adults who will believe them and help them if they're brave enough to ask." Harry's magical education had progressed far beyond the basic theories and simple spells that most children his age were learning. Under the tutelage of experts who were genuinely invested in his success, he was discovering abilities and interests that had been suppressed for years under the Dursleys' regime of magical denial. Advanced transfiguration, Professor Clearwater explained during one of their sessions, requires not just magical power, but also precise visualization and absolute confidence in your intentions. You have to believe completely that the change you're attempting is not only possible but inevitable. Harry concentrated on the wooden block in front of him, visualizing it transforming into the crystal paperweight that Professor Clearwater had demonstrated. The magic flowed through him smoothly, no longer constrained by suppression charms or undermined by self-doubt, and the transformation occurred with an ease that still surprised him. "Excellent work," Professor Clearwater said, examining the perfectly formed crystal. "Your magical development is proceeding remarkably well, considering how long your abilities were artificially suppressed." "Do you think I'll be ready for Hogwarts?" Harry asked. "I mean, really ready, not just academically, but socially?" Professor Clearwater smiled with the particular warmth of an educator who had watched a struggling student discover their true potential. "Harry, you'll be more than ready. You'll be arriving at Hogwarts with something most students lack, the knowledge that you deserve to be there, that you belong in magical society, and that you have people who believe in your success." As September progressed toward October, Harry found himself thinking more frequently about his upcoming Hogwarts education. But unlike the anxious anticipation he might have felt a year ago, his thoughts about magical school were colored by excitement rather than fear. He would be arriving not as a celebrity whose fame preceded him, but as a young man who understood his own worth. Not as someone grateful for any attention, but as someone who expected to be treated with the respect due to any student. Not as a victim of his circumstances, but as someone who had survived those circumstances and chosen to use his experience to help others. "You know," Tonks said one evening as they worked together on a particularly challenging charms assignment, "you're not the same boy who showed up here 2 months ago." Harry considered this, comparing his current self to the frightened, undernourished child who had escaped from Privet Drive. "I suppose not." "You're stronger now, not just physically, but confident. Like you know you belong wherever you are." "I do know that," Harry said, surprising himself with how true the words felt. "I belong here, with this family, in this world, and I'll belong at Hogwarts too when the time comes." The feeling was better than any magic he had yet learned to cast. Chapter 12. The New Beginning. The Hogwarts letter arrived precisely at 11 o'clock on Harry's 11th birthday, delivered by a magnificent tawny owl who waited with dignified patience while the Tonks household erupted in celebration. "It's here!" Tonks shouted from the kitchen window, her hair cycling through every colour in the visible spectrum in her excitement. "Harry, your Hogwarts letter is here!" Harry looked up from the birthday breakfast that Andromeda had prepared, his favourite foods arranged on plates that bore his initials in a dining room decorated with banners that proclaimed his existence a reason for joy rather than tolerance, and felt something warm and certain settle in his chest. A year ago, the arrival of a Hogwarts letter would have meant escape from the Dursleys, a desperate flight toward anything that had to be better than what he was leaving behind. Today, it meant the next chapter in a life that had already become more wonderful than he had ever imagined possible. "May I?" Andromeda asked, gesturing toward the letter with the particular delight of someone who had waited 11 years to share this moment with him. Harry nodded, watching as she broke the wax seal and unfolded the parchment that would officially welcome him into the magical education he had been preparing for all year. "Headmistress McGonagall," Andromeda read aloud, her voice warm with satisfaction. "I like the sound of that." Professor McGonagall had been appointed headmistress of Hogwarts following Dumbledore's disgrace, bringing to the position a reputation for fairness, academic excellence, and unwavering commitment to student welfare. Harry had met with her several times over the past year as part of the transition planning, and he looked forward to beginning his education under someone who saw him as a student rather than a symbol. "Right then," Ted said, consulting the supply list with the methodical attention he brought to all family logistics. "Diagon Alley expedition tomorrow. Books, robes, cauldron, and whatever else catches our young scholar's fancy. And a proper wand," Tonks added with a grin. "None of this borrowed magic nonsense. Time for Harry to get matched with something that's entirely his own." The shopping trip to Diagon Alley was unlike anything Harry had experienced during his previous visits. Instead of the desperate flight from abuse or the tentative exploration of his newfound safety, this was celebration, a family expedition to outfit their son for the education that would prepare him for whatever future he chose to pursue. At Flourish and Blots, Andromeda helped him choose not just the required textbooks, but also supplementary materials that would enrich his understanding. Education, she explained, should be about discovery and wonder, not just memorizing facts for examinations. At Madame Malkin's, the fitting for his school robes was conducted with the same attention to his comfort and preferences that had characterized all his experiences with the Tonks family. "Growing room," Madame Malkin assured them, "but tailored to fit properly. Young wizards should look confident and comfortable, not like they're wearing hand-me-downs." At Ollivander's, the wand selection was a process of discovery that felt almost ceremonial in its significance. "Ah," said Mr. Ollivander, emerging from the depths of his shop with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of matched wands and satisfied customers. "Harry Potter. I was wondering when I'd see you." Harry accepted the first wand offered, holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches, and immediately felt the connection snap into place like the final piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving. The magic that flowed through the wand felt like an extension of his own will, responsive and eager, and entirely his own. "Curious," Mr. Ollivander murmured, studying Harry with the particular attention of someone who rarely encountered anything that surprised him. "Phoenix feather wands choose their wizards very carefully. This one has been waiting for you specifically." "What makes it special?" Harry asked, turning the wand over in his hands and marveling at how perfectly it fit his grip. "Holly is a wood that represents protection and overcoming obstacles," Mr. Ollivander explained. "Phoenix feathers are among the rarest of wand cores, choosing wizards capable of the greatest range of magic. Together, they suggest someone who will use their power to protect others and overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Harry paid for the wand with money from his own vault, enjoying the simple pleasure of purchasing something that belonged entirely to him, chosen specifically for his use, representative of the magic he would learn to cast in service of goals he would choose for himself. The evening before his departure for Hogwarts, Harry sat in his room, organizing his school supplies, and marveling at how different this experience was from what it might have been. Instead of departing from a household that resented his existence, he was leaving family who were proud of his accomplishments and excited about his future. Instead of carrying belongings that were grudgingly provided, he packed possessions chosen with care and affection. "Nervous?" Andromeda asked from the doorway. Harry considered this. "Excited nervous," he said finally, "like waiting for something wonderful to start." "That's exactly what you should be feeling," she assured him, settling on his bed beside his half-packed trunk. "You're going to Hogwarts as yourself, not as a symbol, not as a victim, not as someone grateful for basic treatment. You're going as Harry Potter Tonks, accomplished young wizard, beloved son, and valued friend." The hyphenated name still gave Harry a warm feeling whenever he heard it. The formal adoption had been finalized 3 months ago, giving him not just legal protection, but also the deep security of belonging to people who had chosen to claim him as family. Platform 9 3/4 was bustling with families seeing off their children, but Harry moved through the crowd with steady confidence rather than the overwhelming anxiety that might have characterized this moment a year ago. He knew where he was going, had prepared thoroughly for the experience, and was surrounded by people who believed in his success. "There she is," Ted said with satisfaction, pointing toward the gleaming scarlet engine of the Hogwarts Express. "Right on schedule." The farewells were warm but not desperate. Harry hugged each member of his family with the secure knowledge that he would see them again at Christmas, that letters would flow regularly between Hogwarts and home, that he was going to school rather than leaving family behind. "Learn everything you can," Andromeda said, smoothing down his hair with the unconscious gesture of a mother sending her child off on a grand adventure. "Ask questions when you don't understand something. Make friends with people who value you for who you are. And don't take any nonsense from anyone," Tonks added with a grin. "You know who you are now. Don't let anyone convince you to be smaller than that." On the train, Harry found himself in a compartment with other first-year students, participating in the excited chatter about classes and houses and the magical education they were all beginning. But unlike the desperate gratitude that might have colored such conversations a year ago, Harry participated as an equal, someone who belonged in magical society, who deserved his place at Hogwarts, who had as much right as anyone to be excited about learning magic. "I've heard the Sorting Hat can read your thoughts," said a girl with elaborate braids, whose parents had clearly spared no expense on her school supplies. "I wonder what house it will choose for me." "Does it matter much?" asked a boy, whose accent suggested he came from a farming family. "I mean, they all teach the same subjects, don't they?" Harry found himself explaining what he had learned about the different houses during his preparation, not as someone desperate to fit in, but as someone sharing information that might be helpful to his classmates. "The houses do teach the same subjects," he said, "but they emphasize different values. Gryffindor values bravery and moral courage. Ravenclaw values wisdom and creativity. Hufflepuff values loyalty and fairness, and Slytherin values ambition and cunning." "Which one do you want?" the girl asked. Harry considered this question, which would have terrified him a year ago, but now felt like an interesting puzzle to solve. "I think any of them could be good, as long as the people there value the same things I do. Protecting people who need protection, learning everything I can, being loyal to friends who deserve loyalty." The arrival at Hogwarts was everything Harry had hoped it would be. The castle rose from the lake shore like something from the most ambitious fairy tale, its windows glowing with warm light that promised knowledge and discovery, and the kind of magical education that had been designed specifically for young people like him. Professor McGonagall met the first-year students at the entrance hall with the same mixture of authority and warmth that Harry remembered from their previous meetings. When she caught his eye, she nodded with what might have been approval. Not surprise that he was there, but satisfaction that he was arriving as the confident young wizard she had watched him become over the past year. "Welcome to Hogwarts," she said, addressing the group of nervous first-years with the particular kindness of an educator who understood that beginning anything new required courage. "In a few moments you will be sorted into your houses. Your house will be your home while you're at school. Your housemates will be your companions, your house staff will be your mentors, and your house pride will be something you carry with you long after you graduate." The sorting ceremony was conducted in the Great Hall, whose enchanted ceiling showed a star-filled sky that seemed to stretch into infinity. Harry sat with his fellow first-years at the small table designated for unsorted students and watched as the sorting hat was placed on each new student's head, announcing house placements that were greeted with cheers and applause from the appropriate tables. When his name was called, "Pottertonks, Harry!" he approached the hat with steady steps and settled onto the stool without fear or anxiety. The hat's voice in his mind was warm and slightly amused. "Ah, Harry Potter. I was wondering when I would meet you. You've changed quite a bit since I last saw you in this hall." "When did you see me before?" Harry thought back. "You were here as an infant, the night your parents died. You were brought here for safety before other arrangements could be made. You were frightened then, and hungry, and quite alone in the world." The hat paused, and Harry could feel it examining his thoughts and memories. "But you're none of those things now, are you? You know who you are, you understand your worth, and you're surrounded by people who value your well-being. You've learned that true strength comes not from enduring suffering, but from refusing to let that suffering define you." "Which house do I belong in?" Harry asked. "Any of them could claim you," the hat replied thoughtfully. "You have the courage that Gryffindor values, the wisdom that Ravenclaw prizes, the loyalty that Hufflepuff treasures, and the determination that Slytherin respects. But I think, given your particular journey and your demonstrated commitment to protecting others who cannot protect themselves, there is one house that will help you grow into the wizard you're meant to become." The hat's voice rang out across the Great Hall. "Gryffindor!" The applause from the Gryffindor table was immediate and enthusiastic, welcoming him not as a celebrity, but as a new member of their house family. Harry made his way to the table with a sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with fame, and everything to do with finding his place among people who shared his values. The feast that followed was a celebration of abundance and community that Harry enjoyed without reservation. He ate his fill of excellent food, participated in conversations with his new housemates about classes and expectations, and basked in the simple pleasure of belonging somewhere that wanted him to succeed. Later, in the Gryffindor common room, Harry settled down to write his first letter home from Hogwarts. "Dear Mum, Dad, and Tonks, I arrived safely at Hogwarts and have been sorted into Gryffindor House. Professor McGonagall says Gryffindor values bravery and moral courage, which makes me think of all the times you've been brave for me over the past year. The castle is even more amazing than I imagined. The staircases move, the portraits talk, and the ceiling in the Great Hall shows the actual sky outside. My dorm mates seem friendly, and I think I'm going to like my classes. The sorting hat told me something interesting. It said I could have been placed in any of the 4 houses, but that Gryffindor would help me grow into the wizard I'm meant to become. I think that means it sees the same potential in me that you've always said you see. Thank you for everything you've given me this year. Not just the safety and love and family, but also the confidence to be excited about my future instead of afraid of it. I wouldn't be here without you, and I certainly wouldn't be here feeling like I belong. I'll write again soon with more details about my classes and teachers. Give my love to everyone at home. Your son, Harry. As he sealed the letter and prepared it for Hedwig to carry home, Harry reflected on how different this moment was from what it might have been. Instead of writing to people who saw his absence as relief, he was writing to family who would miss him and celebrate his accomplishments. Instead of hoping to survive his magical education, he was planning to excel at it. Most importantly, instead of arriving at Hogwarts as someone grateful for any attention or kindness, he was beginning his education as someone who understood his own worth, who had people who loved him unconditionally, and who had learned that the most powerful magic of all was the knowledge that he deserved to take up space in the world. Outside his dormitory window, the grounds of Hogwarts stretched away into the Scottish Highlands, holding promises of knowledge and friendship and adventures that would be chosen rather than endured. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by people who wanted him to be there, with a future that held infinite possibilities. The feeling was better than any magic he would ever learn to cast. It was the